The doors of the great hall burst open before anyone was ready, and the room fell into a silence so heavy, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Cale Ashbourne stood at the top of the marble steps, his crown catching the candlelight, his jaw set hard as stone. Below him, in a gown of pale silver, stood Lyra, her hands folded, her chin lifted with practiced pride, waiting for the words every soul in the kingdom expected to hear. They were the words that would never come. "I reject you," Cale said, his voice carrying across the hall like a blade cutting through fabric. "I will not take you as my mate." For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the murmurs began, rising like a wave crashing against the stone pillars. Lyra's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She had spent her whole life preparing for this night, learning the customs of the court, practicing the bow she would give when she was finally named queen. She had believed, with everything in her, that she belonged beside him. Why? She finally managed, her voice cracking under the weight of 200 watching eyes. Cale did not answer right away. He looked at her the way a merchant looks at goods that do not meet his standard, cold and assessing. When he finally spoke, his words landed like stones thrown into still water. "A king needs a mate who can command a room, someone people look up to, not someone they overlook." The insult was aimed at her size, at the fact that she stood a full head shorter than most Omegas in the court, at the delicate frame she had never once been ashamed of until this very moment. Lyra felt the heat rise in her throat, felt her eyes burn, but she refused to let the tears fall in front of the entire kingdom. She turned, gathered what remained of her dignity, and walked out of the hall with her back straight and her heart shattered into pieces too small to count. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the sound echoed through the hall louder than any words Cale had spoken. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold against her skin. Lyra did not stop walking until she reached the edge of the palace gardens, where the hedges grew tall enough to hide her from the guards patrolling the walls. There, finally, she let herself break. She sank to the ground beside a stone fountain, her silver gown pooling around her like spilled moonlight, and she cried until her chest ached and her throat felt raw. She thought of every year she had spent training to be worthy of a crown. Every lesson in diplomacy, every hour spent learning the histories of neighboring packs, every sacrifice she had made to prepare herself for a life she now understood would never be hers. All of it, undone in the space of a single sentence, in front of everyone who mattered. By morning, the news had spread through every corner of the kingdom. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Guards murmured it at the gates. Nobles discussed it over their morning meals, as though it were nothing more than gossip to season their tea. Nobody asked how Lyra was faring. Nobody wondered if she needed comfort. The only question anyone seemed to care about was what this meant for the king, and for the pack's future. Inside the palace, Cale sat alone in his private chambers, staring out over the training grounds where soldiers moved through their morning drills. His advisor, a steady and serious man named Edmund, entered without knocking, as he had done since Cale was a boy, learning to hold a sword taller than himself. "The council is unhappy," Edmund said, closing the door behind him. "They believe you acted rashly." "I acted according to what the pack needs," Cale replied, not turning from the window. "The pack needs a king who does not humiliate his intended mate in front of the entire court," Edmund said, his tone sharp enough to make even a king flinch. There were other ways to handle this, Cale. Quieter ways. Kinder ways. Cale's jaw tightened. He was young to hold the crown, having taken the throne only months earlier after his father's sudden passing, and every decision he made was scrutinized, as though the fate of the entire pack hung on it. Perhaps it did. He had convinced himself that strength meant never showing hesitation, that a king who softened even once would be seen as weak by every rival pack watching from beyond the borders. "It is done," Cale said. "There is no use discussing it further." Edmund studied him for a long moment, the way he had studied him since childhood, searching for the boy beneath the crown. "You will regret this," he said quietly. "Not today, not this month, but one day, you will understand what you gave up in that hall." He left without waiting for a response, and Cale remained by the window long after the door closed, though he refused to admit, even to himself, that Edmund's words had settled somewhere deep and uncomfortable in his chest. Weeks passed, and the kingdom slowly returned to its normal rhythms. though an undercurrent of tension remained beneath the surface. Lyra disappeared from public life entirely, retreating to a distant estate owned by her family, far from the palace and its prying eyes. Chaol threw himself into the duties of ruling, attending council meetings, settling border disputes, training with his soldiers until his muscles ached and his mind was too tired to wander toward thoughts he did not want to have. It was on one such evening, when the sky had turned the deep orange of a dying sun, that Chaol decided to ride out alone toward the northern border. His advisors protested, insisting a king should never travel without an escort, but Chaol needed the silence of the open land more than he needed their company. He needed to remember what it felt like to be simply a man, not a crown, not a symbol, just himself, moving through the world. The northern woods were quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel enormous. Chaol rode along the familiar trail his father had once shown him, past the old watchtower, past the stream that marked the boundary of Ashbourne territory. He was nearly ready to turn back when a scent caught him completely off guard. It was faint at first, carried on the evening breeze, but it grew stronger the closer he rode toward the tree line. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered, warm and unfamiliar, threading through the cold evening air like a thread of gold through gray cloth. Every instinct in him sharpened at once. His horse grew restless beneath him, sensing the shift in his focus, and Chaol dismounted without a second thought, following the scent on foot through the thickening trees. He found her collapsed near a fallen log, her cloak torn at the shoulder, her dark hair tangled with leaves and dirt. For a moment, Chaol simply stood there, staring, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. She was small, smaller than most Omegas he had encountered, but there was something about the way she lay there, even unconscious, that struck him as anything but fragile. Her hands were curled into fists, as though even in her weakened state, some part of her refused to surrender. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, and found it steady beneath his fingers, though weak. There was a wound along her side, shallow but concerning, likely from a fall or an encounter with something in these woods that had not treated her kindly. Chaol's advisors would tell him to leave her, to send word back to the palace, and let the border guards handle whatever stranger had wandered onto Ashbourne land. But something in him refused to consider it. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, and carried her back to his horse. The ride back to the palace felt longer than any journey he had taken in recent memory, his mind circling endlessly around the strange, warm scent that clung to her, a scent that seemed to settle something restless inside his chest, that he had not even realized was unsettled. When he arrived at the palace gates, the guards startled at the sight of their king carrying an unconscious stranger in his arms. Word spread quickly through the halls, and by the time Chaol reached the infirmary, Edmund was already waiting, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Who is she?" Edmund asked, watching as the healers rushed forward to take the young woman from Chaol's arms. "I don't know," Chaol admitted. "I found her near the northern border, wounded." Edmund studied the stranger's face as the healers laid her carefully on a bed, then glanced back at Chaol, with an expression he could not quite read. "You brought her here yourself. You could have sent guards." "There was no time," Chaol said, though even he was not entirely convinced by his own explanation. The healers worked quickly, cleaning the wound along her side, checking for injuries, murmuring quietly among themselves about her condition. Chaol remained near the doorway, unwilling to leave despite having no logical reason to stay. He told himself he simply wanted to know that whoever she was would recover, that his conscience would not allow him to abandon someone he had found in such a state. But some quieter, more honest part of him knew the truth ran deeper than simple concern. It was nearly midnight when the healers finally stepped back, informing him that the stranger's condition had stabilized, though she remained unconscious. Chaol approached the bedside slowly, studying her features in the dim light of the infirmary. Her face was calm now, free of the tension that had marked her expression when he first found her. There was a quiet strength in the set of her jaw, even in sleep, that made him wonder what kind of life had shaped her into someone who could carry herself with such resolve, even while unconscious and wounded. "She's an Omega," one of the healers said quietly, coming to stand beside him, "though her scent is unusual, stronger than most we've encountered." Chaol said nothing, but the observation matched exactly what he had noticed in the woods. There was something about her presence that felt different, felt significant in a way he could not yet explain, He stayed until the early hours of the morning, watching over her from a chair near the window, telling himself he was simply ensuring she remained stable. When exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep, his last thought before drifting off was the memory of finding her in the woods, small and wounded but unmistakably strong, and the strange, warm feeling that had settled in his chest the moment her scent first reached him. He woke to the sound of movement, and his eyes snapped open to find her sitting upright in the bed, staring at him with sharp, wary eyes the color of storm clouds. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. "Where am I?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse but steady, carrying none of the fear he might have expected from someone waking in an unfamiliar place. "You're safe," Cale said, rising from his chair. "I found you in the northern woods. You were wounded." She studied him carefully, her gaze moving over his face, his clothing, the crown resting on a nearby table, where he had removed it the night before. If she recognized him as the king, she gave no indication of it, and something about that fact struck Cale as oddly refreshing. "Thank you," she said simply, though there was a guardedness in her tone that suggested trust did not come easily to her. "I need to leave soon. I have somewhere I need to be." "You should rest," Cale said. "Your wound needs time to heal." "I don't have time," she replied, already attempting to swing her legs off the bed, though she winced the moment she put weight on her side. Cale moved forward instinctively, catching her before she could stumble, and for one brief moment, their eyes met at close range. The warm scent he had noticed in the woods intensified now, wrapping around him like something alive, and he felt his own pulse quicken in response, an unfamiliar reaction that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You should rest," he repeated, more firmly this time, guiding her carefully back onto the bed. She studied him again, something shifting behind her stormy eyes, though she did not argue further. "What is your name?" she finally asked. Cale hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Cale." "I'm Ren," she said, settling back against the pillows, though her guarded expression remained firmly in place. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment in the infirmary, just how much that simple exchange of names would come to mean, or how completely their lives were about to become entangled with one another. Outside, the sun was rising over the Ashbourne Palace, casting long golden light across the halls, where whispers of the king's rejection still lingered in every corner. But inside that small infirmary room, something new had begun, something neither of them yet understood, though both could feel its weight settling quietly into place. Later that morning, Edmund returned to the infirmary, his sharp eyes taking in the sight of Ren sitting upright, alert, and clearly unwilling to remain a patient for long. He gave Cale a questioning look before addressing the stranger directly. "You were found near the northern border," Edmund said. "That land is dangerous for anyone traveling alone, especially at night. May I ask what brought you there?" Ren's expression closed slightly, the openness she had shown Cale moments earlier retreating behind a wall of caution. "I was traveling. I did not mean to trespass on Ashbourne land." "You are not in trouble," Cale said, before Edmund could press further. "You are welcome to stay until you have fully recovered." Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly at the offer, but he said nothing, simply nodding and excusing himself from the room, though Cale noticed the concern lingering in his old advisor's expression as he left. He understood the unspoken worry. A king inviting an unknown traveler to remain within the palace walls, only weeks after publicly rejecting his intended mate, was certain to draw attention and speculation from every corner of the court. But Cale found he did not care, not in the way he expected to. Over the following days, Ren remained in the palace, her wound healing steadily under the care of the healers, though she made it clear she had no intention of staying idle. By the third day, she had convinced the healers to let her walk the halls under supervision, insisting she felt strong enough to move about freely. Cale found himself drawn to the gardens each afternoon around the same time, telling himself it was simply for fresh air, though some quieter part of him knew exactly who he hoped to encounter there. He found her sitting beneath one of the old oak trees on the fourth day, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the palace guards move through their afternoon drills, with an intensity that suggested more than passing curiosity. "You watch them like you understand what they're doing," Cale observed, settling onto the stone bench nearby. "I've seen soldiers train before," Ren said, not taking her eyes off the drill formation. Their footwork is sloppy. Whoever is training them favors strength over speed. Kale blinked, surprised by the sharp accuracy of her observation. Few people outside his personal guard would have noticed such a detail, let alone commented on it so directly. "You know something about combat training?" "I know enough," she said simply, offering no further explanation, though something flickered behind her eyes that suggested a story she was not yet ready to share. They fell into an easy silence after that, watching the soldiers continue their drills, and Kale found himself unexpectedly comfortable in the quiet, a feeling he rarely experienced in the company of anyone at court. There was no performance in the way Ren carried herself, no careful calculation of what to say to please him, no awareness at all, it seemed, of the fact that she sat beside a king. She simply existed as herself, sharp and unguarded in her own way, and Kale realized he had not felt this at ease with another person in longer than he could remember. "Why did you help me?" Ren asked suddenly, turning to study him directly. "You didn't know me. You could have sent guards instead of carrying me yourself." Kale considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the response. "Something told me I needed to." Ren studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the truth of his words, before finally nodding, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered. Most people in my position have made worse decisions than helping a stranger," Kale said quietly, thinking of the hall, of Lyra's stricken face, of the cruel words he had spoken in front of the entire court. Ren tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering across her features. "What do you mean?" Kale hesitated, unsure why he felt compelled to explain himself to someone he had known for only a few days, yet the words came anyway. "I rejected someone, publicly, in front of the whole court. It wasn't handled well." Something shifted in Ren's expression, though she did not offer judgment, simply studying him with an intensity that made him feel oddly exposed. "Why did you reject them?" The question landed harder than he expected, and Kale found himself struggling to answer honestly. The truth, when he finally admitted it to himself, felt shameful in a way he had not allowed himself to acknowledge before now. "Because of her size," he said quietly. "I told myself a king needed someone who could command attention, someone people would look up to, in every sense of the word." Ren's expression remained carefully neutral, though Kale thought he saw something tighten briefly around her eyes. "And do you still believe that?" He did not answer right away, his gaze drifting back toward the soldiers training in the distance, though he no longer saw them at all. He thought instead of Ren's sharp eyes and sharper mind, of the quiet strength she carried despite her small frame, of how completely his assumptions about size and presence had been upended in the span of a few short days. "I'm not sure what I believe anymore," he finally admitted. Ren said nothing further, though the silence between them felt different now, heavier with unspoken understanding. She rose slowly from the bench, testing her healing wound with careful movement, and Kale stood as well, instinctively reaching out to steady her, though she did not need his help. "I should return to the infirmary," she said, though something in her tone suggested reluctance to end their conversation. "I'll walk with you," Kale offered, and she did not object. As they made their way back through the palace gardens, Kale found his mind returning again and again to her question, turning it over like a stone in his palm, examining it from every angle. Did he still believe size determined worth? Did he still believe a king required a mate who could command a room through sheer presence alone? The certainty that had felt so absolute weeks earlier, standing in that great hall delivering his cruel rejection, now felt increasingly hollow, increasingly difficult to justify even to himself. That evening, as Ren settled back into the infirmary and Kale retreated to his private chambers, he found himself standing once again at the window, staring out over the training grounds exactly as he had the morning after his rejection of Lyra. But where his thoughts had once circled endlessly around duty and image and the expectations of the crown, they now circled around a pair of sharp, storm-colored eyes and a scent that had settled into his senses like something he had been missing his entire life, without realizing it. He did not yet understand what was happening to him, could not yet name the pull he felt whenever Ren was near, but he understood enough to know that something fundamental had shifted the moment he found her in those northern woods. Whatever certainty had guided his decisions until now had cracked, and through that crack, something new and unexpected had begun to take root. Far away, at the distant estate where she had retreated after her humiliation, Lyra sat alone in her chambers, staring at a letter she had received that morning from a contact within the palace, informing her of the stranger the king had brought back from the northern border, the stranger who now walked freely through the halls that should have belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she read the words a second time, then a third, feeling something cold and sharp settle into her chest. She had lost everything in that great hall weeks ago, her position, her pride, her future. And now, it seemed, someone else was already stepping into the place that had once been promised to her. Lyra folded the letter carefully, her expression hardening into something far less fragile than the heartbroken young woman who had fled the palace gardens that terrible night. Whatever was happening within those palace walls, she intended to find out exactly what it meant, and exactly what role, if any, remained for her to play in the story that was still unfolding, whether she was present to witness it or not. A crash of glass echoed through the palace kitchens, and within seconds, 3 guards were sprinting toward the sound, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. What they found was not an intruder, but Wren, standing over a shattered pitcher, her hands raised defensively, her eyes locked on a kitchen servant who had fainted against the counter beside her. "She just collapsed," Wren said quickly, kneeling beside the unconscious woman. "Get a healer. Now." The guards hesitated, still wary of the stranger who had been given free rein of the palace, despite her unclear origins, but the urgency in Wren's voice cut through their suspicion. One of them ran for help, while the others watched Wren check the servant's pulse with practiced, steady hands, tilting her head to listen for breathing, pressing gentle fingers against her throat. "She's breathing, but weak," Wren said. "I think it's her heart." By the time the healers arrived, Wren had already loosened the woman's collar and elevated her feet, actions that the head healer later admitted likely saved the servant's life by keeping blood flowing to her brain during the critical minutes before proper treatment could begin. Word of the incident spread through the palace by midday, and for the first time since her arrival, the whispers about Wren shifted from suspicion to something closer to curiosity. Cale heard the story from Edmund that afternoon, and something in his chest tightened with an emotion he could not immediately identify. Pride, perhaps, though he had no right to feel proud of a stranger's actions. Or perhaps it was simply confirmation of something he had already begun to suspect, that Wren carried far more depth and skill than her quiet, guarded demeanor suggested. He found her near the infirmary that evening, still faintly smelling of the herbs she had used to help calm the recovering servant, and something about the sight of her, focused and competent even in a moment of crisis, made his pulse quicken in a way he was growing less able to ignore. "You saved her life," Cale said, approaching slowly. Wren looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her features, before settling back into her usual guarded calm. "I did what anyone would have done." "Not anyone," Cale countered. "Most people would have panicked. You knew exactly what to do." She shrugged, though the gesture seemed practiced, deliberately casual, as though deflecting attention was second nature to her. "I've had reason to learn." "What reason?" Cale asked, genuinely curious, though he sensed immediately that he had pushed too far. Wren's expression closed off completely, the openness from their conversation in the gardens replaced by something guarded and distant. "It doesn't matter," she said, turning away. "I should check on her again before I rest." She disappeared down the corridor before Cale could respond, leaving him standing alone with more questions than he had arrived with. He understood, on some level, that Wren carried secrets she was not ready to share, perhaps not with anyone, and certainly not with a king she had known for less than a week. But the mystery only deepened his fascination, rather than dampening it, and he found himself determined to understand the woman who had so quickly become impossible to ignore. That night, sleep eluded him entirely. He paced his chambers for hours, his mind circling around fragments of conversation, the memory of her sharp eyes assessing the soldiers' training formations, the confidence in her hands as she cared for the fainting servant, the flash of something like pain that crossed her face whenever questions about her past arose. Eventually, exhausted but unable to quiet his thoughts, he made his way toward the palace library, hoping the familiar quiet of the shelves might settle his restless mind. He was not expecting to find Wren there. She sat curled in a window seat near the back of the library, a thick book open across her lap, the moonlight illuminating her features as she read with an intensity that suggested complete absorption in whatever story held her attention. She did not notice him at first, and Cale found himself simply watching her for a long moment, struck by how different she looked in this unguarded state, free of the careful composure she maintained during their daytime interactions. "Couldn't sleep either?" he finally said, and she startled, closing the book quickly, as though caught doing something forbidden. "I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places," she admitted, some of her guard lowering slightly in the quiet intimacy of the empty library. Cale settled into the chair across from her, careful to keep enough distance to avoid crowding her, though every instinct in him wanted to close that distance entirely. "What are you reading?" She hesitated before answering, glancing down at the worn cover of the book. "Old Pack Histories. I was curious about the history of this territory. Find anything interesting?" "Some," she said carefully, though something in her tone suggested she was choosing her words with deliberate caution. "There are references to an old Omega lineage connected to this land, generations back. The details are vague, but the histories mention some kind of debt owed by the ruling family." Cale frowned, searching his memory for any mention of such a debt from his own education in Pack history, but nothing surfaced. "I've never heard of that." "Most people haven't," Wren said. "The records are old, and much of it seems to have been deliberately obscured over time." Something about the careful way she spoke, the precision of her phrasing, made Cale suspect she knew far more about this topic than she was willing to reveal. But he did not press further, sensing that trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt, and he had no intention of frightening away the first person, in longer than he could remember, who spoke to him, as though he were simply a man, rather than a crown to be managed or feared. They talked for hours after that, the conversation drifting from Pack history to lighter subjects, the strange customs of neighboring territories, the best routes for traveling safely through mountain passes, the kinds of stories told around campfires in the villages Wren had passed through during her travels. Cale found himself laughing more freely than he had in months, genuinely enjoying the sharp wit that emerged once Wren allowed herself to relax, the way she challenged his assumptions without hesitation, refusing to simply agree with him the way so many others at court did out of deference to his rank. By the time the first hints of dawn began coloring the sky outside the library windows, Cale understood, with a clarity that startled him, that whatever he felt toward Wren had grown into something far beyond simple curiosity or gratitude for her kindness toward the fainting servant. It had become something he could no longer easily dismiss or explain away, something that unsettled the careful control he had maintained over every aspect of his life since taking the crown. Wren seemed to sense the shift as well, her expression growing thoughtful as their conversation finally wound down, though she said nothing directly about it. Instead, she simply studied him for a long moment, before rising from the window seat, the worn history book cradled against her chest. "Thank you for the conversation," she said quietly. "I haven't talked to anyone like that in a long time." "Neither have I," Cale admitted, and something in the honesty of the exchange settled between them, quiet and significant, though neither was yet ready to name exactly what it meant. Meanwhile, far from the palace, Lyra's careful planning had begun to take shape. The letter she had received about the mysterious stranger had led her to seek out allies, individuals within the court who resented the young king's abrupt and public rejection nearly as much as she did, individuals who saw opportunity in the instability her humiliation had created. Among them was Garrick, the ambitious leader of a neighboring pack who had long viewed Ashbourne territory with interest, eager for any excuse to weaken the young king's position and expand his own influence. "The king humiliated you in front of his entire court," Garrick said, his tone smooth and persuasive, as they met in the quiet study of Lyra's family estate. "And now he shelters some unknown stranger within his own palace. The nobles are already whispering about his judgment. This is an opportunity neither of us should waste." Lyra studied him carefully, weighing the offer in his words against the pain still lodged deep in her chest. She had loved Cale once, or believed she had, though that feeling had curdled into something far more bitter in the weeks since her rejection. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Simply that we work together," Garrick said. "You know the court, the customs, the weaknesses in Ashbourne's political structure. I have resources, and allies of my own who share an interest in seeing the young king's rule destabilized." Lyra considered his words carefully, aware that aligning herself with a rival pack leader carried significant risk, but also aware of how little she had left to lose. Her reputation had already been shattered in that great hall. Her future within Ashbourne territory had already been stripped away with a single cruel sentence. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to build a new future entirely, one where she held the power, rather than waiting to be granted it by someone else's judgment. "I'm listening," she said finally, and Garrick's expression shifted into something satisfied, almost predatory, though Lyra was too consumed by her own bitterness to notice the warning signs in his careful, calculated smile. Back within the palace walls, unaware of the alliance quietly forming against him, Cale found himself increasingly drawn into Ren's orbit with each passing day. Their conversations in the library became a nightly occurrence, their walks through the gardens a daily ritual neither of them acknowledged aloud but both clearly anticipated. The court began to notice, the whispers shifting once again, this time filled with speculation about the true nature of the king's growing fascination with the mysterious stranger he had brought back from the northern woods. Edmund, ever watchful, approached Cale one afternoon, with concern etched clearly across his weathered features. "The council has begun asking questions," he said carefully, "about your intentions toward this woman." "There is nothing to report," Cale replied, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "Cale," Edmund said, using his given name rather than his title, a habit reserved only for moments of genuine seriousness between them. "I have known you since you were a boy. I can see what is happening, even if you refuse to acknowledge it yourself." Cale said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the gardens where he knew Ren often walked in the late afternoon light. Whatever certainty had once guided his understanding of duty, of what a king required from a mate, had crumbled entirely in the weeks since he first found her wounded in the northern woods. He no longer knew what he believed, only that the thought of Ren leaving the palace, returning to whatever mysterious life awaited her beyond Ashbourne territory, filled him with a dread he had never associated with anyone before in his life. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold over the palace grounds, Cale made his way toward the gardens, determined to finally understand exactly what Ren meant to him, and exactly what he intended to do about it, before circumstances beyond his control took that choice away from him entirely. He found her sitting beside the same stone fountain where he had first noticed her watching the soldiers train, her knees drawn up, her eyes distant with thoughts he could not read. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression softened slightly, an acknowledgement of the closeness that had grown between them over the past several days. "You look troubled," she observed, as he settled onto the bench beside her. "I've been thinking," Cale admitted, choosing his words carefully, "about what happens when your wound has fully healed, about what you'll do then." Ren's expression grew guarded once more, though she did not look away from him. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "Would you consider staying?" The question left his lips before he had fully decided to ask it, and he watched her carefully for any reaction, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. Ren was quiet for a long moment, studying the water rippling gently in the fountain beside them. "Why would you want that?" Cale hesitated, aware that whatever he said next carried significant weight, aware that he stood at the edge of admitting something he had not yet allowed himself to fully acknowledge, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Because these past days, talking with you, have felt more honest than anything I've experienced since taking this crown. Because I find myself thinking about you constantly, wondering what you're doing, wondering when I'll see you next. I don't fully understand it, but I know I don't want it to end." Ren's breath caught slightly, her storm-colored eyes searching his face, as though trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply another form of the careful performance so common among nobles at court. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension in her shoulders eased. "I've never had anywhere that felt like it wanted me to stay," she said quietly, her voice carrying a vulnerability Cale had not heard from her before. "My whole life, I've been the one who leaves, or the one who gets left behind." "You wouldn't be leaving here," Cale said, "not unless you chose to." Something flickered across her expression, hope and hesitation warring visibly beneath the surface. "There are things about me you don't know," she said carefully. "Things that might change how you feel, if you knew them." "Then tell me," Cale said. "Whatever it is, I want to understand." Ren studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust him with whatever truth she had been guarding since her arrival. But before she could answer, a guard approached hurriedly from the palace entrance, interrupting the moment with news that pulled Chaol immediately back into his duties as king. "Your Majesty," the guard said, slightly out of breath, "riders have arrived from the southern border. They report unusual movement from Garrick's territory. The council requests your presence immediately." Chaol's jaw tightened at the mention of Garrick's name, an old rival whose ambitions toward Ashbourne territory had simmered for years beneath a thin veneer of diplomatic courtesy. He rose reluctantly, torn between his duty to the kingdom and his desire to remain here, in this quiet garden, finally close to understanding the mystery of the woman beside him. "We'll continue this conversation," he said, looking back at Wren, with a promise clear in his eyes. She nodded, though something like relief flickered briefly across her features. Relief that the conversation had been interrupted before she was forced to reveal whatever secret still weighed on her. Chaol did not notice the flicker of relief, too preoccupied with the news of movement along the southern border. But had he looked closer, he might have understood sooner just how deep and complicated the truth about Wren truly ran. As Chaol hurried toward the council chambers, unaware of the alliance quietly forming against him beyond his borders, Wren remained in the garden long after he had gone, her thoughts heavy with the knowledge that whatever peace she had found within these palace walls could not last indefinitely. The truth about her lineage, about the old debt her ancestors had never collected, about the reasons she had truly wandered onto Ashbourne land that fateful night, all of it remained buried beneath careful silence. But secrets, she knew from painful experience, rarely stayed buried forever. And she could only hope that when the truth finally surfaced, whatever fragile connection had grown between herself and the young king would prove strong enough to survive it. The council chamber erupted into arguing voices the moment Chaol stepped through the doors, the tension in the room thick enough to cut through with a blade. Maps of the southern border were spread across the long table, marked with small wooden pieces, indicating troop movements that had been reported over the past several hours. "Garrick has moved nearly 200 soldiers to the border," one of the older council members said, his weathered finger tapping against the map. "This is no routine patrol, this is a show of force." "Or preparation for something worse," another voice added grimly. Chaol moved to the head of the table, studying the map with sharp focus, forcing his mind away from the garden, away from Wren's unfinished confession, and toward the immediate threat facing his kingdom. "What do we know about his intentions?" "Nothing confirmed," Edmund said, standing near the window with his arms crossed. "But the timing is suspicious. Garrick has never moved this aggressively before, not since the border disputes were settled under your father's rule. Could this be connected to Lyra?" One of the younger council members asked hesitantly, glancing around the room as though unsure whether the question was appropriate to voice aloud. The room fell silent for a moment, the unspoken tension of Chaol's public rejection still lingering in every corner of the court weeks later. Edmund's expression grew troubled, though he chose his next words carefully. "There have been reports of her traveling to meet with representatives from Garrick's territory. It is possible she has sought an alliance." Chaol's jaw tightened at the implication, though he could hardly blame Lyra for seeking allies elsewhere after the humiliation he had subjected her to in front of the entire court. Still, the thought of his own actions potentially destabilizing the security of his kingdom weighed heavily on him, another consequence of a decision he increasingly regretted. "We need more information before we act," Chaol said finally. "Send scouts to monitor the border more closely. I want daily reports on any further movement." The council agreed, though the tension in the room did not ease entirely, and Chaol remained long after the meeting concluded, studying the map, turning over every possible scenario in his mind. It was well past midnight by the time he finally made his way back through the quiet palace halls, his thoughts a tangled mix of political strategy and the unfinished conversation with Wren that continued to pull at his attention despite the gravity of the border situation. He found her still awake, sitting in the library exactly where he had left her hours earlier, though the book in her lap had long since been abandoned, her gaze distant and troubled. "You waited," he said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," she admitted. The messenger seemed urgent. Chaol studied her for a long moment before deciding to share what he had learned, some instinct telling him that whatever secrets Wren carried, she deserved honesty in return for the trust he was asking of her. Garrick has moved soldiers to our southern border. There are reports that Lyra may have allied herself with him. Ren's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly at the mention of Lyra's name, something flickering behind her eyes that Cale could not quite identify, though he was too distracted by the weight of the political crisis to examine it closely. "Do you think there will be conflict?" she asked carefully. "I don't know," Cale admitted, "but I intend to prevent it if I can. My father spent years securing peace along that border. I won't be the king who loses it." Ren nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled, and Cale found himself reaching out instinctively, taking her hand in his own, a gesture that surprised them both with its sudden intimacy. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you here, beside me, if you're willing to stay." For a moment, Ren simply looked at their joined hands, her expression unreadable, before finally meeting his gaze directly. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice steady, despite the visible nervousness in her posture. "Something about why I was in the northern woods that night." Cale straightened slightly, giving her his full attention, sensing that whatever she was about to share had weighed on her since the moment she woke in the infirmary days earlier. "I'm listening." "My family," Ren began slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, "has old ties to this territory. Generations ago, before your family rose to power here, my ancestors were driven from this land during a conflict that was never fully resolved. The histories your court keeps have mostly erased what happened, but my family remembers. We've always remembered." Cale's mind raced back to their earlier conversation in the library, to Ren's careful mention of an old debt owed by the ruling family, and he understood suddenly that she had not been speaking hypothetically at all. "You're saying my family wronged yours." "I'm saying there's history between us that goes back further than either of us realized when I first arrived here," Ren said. "I came to this territory because my grandmother, before she passed, asked me to understand what had happened to our family, to see this land for myself. I never expected to be injured, and I certainly never expected to find myself brought into the palace by the king himself." Cale absorbed this information slowly, aware that it complicated everything about their growing connection, aware that questions of old debts and ancestral conflicts carried weight far beyond simple personal feelings. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't know how you would react," Ren admitted. "Because I've spent my whole life being underestimated, being told my worth depended on things I couldn't control, and I didn't want that history to become another reason for you to see me differently, before you had the chance to simply know me first." Something in her words struck Cale deeply, an echo of his own cruelty toward Lyra, his own assumption that worth could be measured by size, or presence, or bloodline, rather than character. He understood, with sudden painful clarity, exactly how much weight his careless words in that great hall had carried, and exactly how much courage it must have taken Ren to share this truth with him now, knowing the risk it carried. "It changes nothing about how I feel toward you," Cale said firmly. "If anything, it makes me want to understand this history more fully, to make right whatever wrong was done to your family, if that's possible." Relief washed visibly over Ren's features, her guarded posture easing for the first time since she had begun her confession. "I hoped you would say that," she admitted, "though I wasn't certain." They talked long into the night after that, Ren sharing pieces of her family's history that had been passed down through generations, stories of displacement and loss that predated even Cale's grandfather's rule, details that painted a far more complicated picture of Ashbourne history than anything Cale had learned in his formal education. He listened with genuine attention, asking questions, seeking to understand rather than simply defend his family's legacy, and by the time dawn began breaking over the palace, something had shifted fundamentally between them, a trust built on honesty, rather than convenient silence. But even as their bond deepened within the quiet privacy of the library, forces beyond their control continued moving steadily toward confrontation. At the southern border, Garrick's soldiers maintained their aggressive positioning, while within his own war tent, Garrick himself met with Lyra to finalize the details of their growing alliance. "The scouts report the king has been seen frequently in the company of an unknown woman," Garrick said, studying a report handed to him by one of his advisors. "Some kind of stranger he brought back from the northern woods weeks ago." Lyra's expression tightened at the mention, old wounds reopening, despite her attempts to move past the humiliation of her rejection. "What do you intend to do with this information?" "Nothing yet," Garrick said thoughtfully. "But knowledge is valuable, especially knowledge the court itself seems reluctant to discuss openly. If this stranger holds any significance beyond simple curiosity, it could prove useful to our cause." Lyra considered his words carefully, torn between her desire for revenge against the king who had humiliated her so publicly, and a growing unease about the direction their alliance was taking. She had wanted justice, had wanted Cale to understand the pain his cruelty had caused her. But watching Garrick move soldiers toward the border, watching him calculate every piece of information as a potential weapon, she began to wonder whether she had traded one kind of danger for something far more calculated and cold. "I want no part in actual conflict," she said finally. "I agreed to help destabilize his rule politically, not to start a war." Garrick's expression remained smooth, unreadable, though something calculating flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Of course," he said, "political pressure alone should be sufficient, assuming the king responds reasonably to our demands." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Garrick's private ambitions extended far beyond simple political pressure, ambitions Lyra remained unaware of, as their alliance continued to solidify, drawing all three of them, Cale, Ren, and Lyra herself, steadily toward a confrontation none of them could yet fully anticipate. Back within the palace, morning light finally broke through the library windows, illuminating Cale and Ren where they still sat together, their conversation having drifted from history into quieter, gentler territory as the night wore on. Cale studied her face in the soft morning light, struck once again by the strength and resilience she carried, despite everything life had thrown against her, and he understood with growing certainty that whatever history connected their families, whatever complications lay ahead with Garrick's aggressive border movements, his feelings toward Ren had grown into something he no longer wished to fight or deny. "Stay," he said simply, echoing his request from the garden the previous evening. "Whatever comes next, whatever conflicts we face, I want to face them with you beside me." Ren studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of hesitation or doubt, before finally allowing herself a small, genuine smile. The first true smile Cale had seen from her since their first meeting in the infirmary. "Then I'll stay," she said quietly, and something settled peacefully between them, a quiet promise neither of them yet understood the full weight of, though both could feel its significance settling into place. Outside the library windows, the palace grounds stirred to life with the beginning of a new day, guards changing shifts, servants beginning their morning duties, entirely unaware of the quiet, significant moment unfolding within the library walls, or of the gathering storm building steadily along the southern border, a storm that would soon test every bond of trust and loyalty within the Ashbourne kingdom. 3 days later, the fragile calm shattered entirely when a scout returned from the southern border, bloodied and barely able to stand, reporting that a patrol of 6 Ashbourne soldiers had been ambushed near the boundary line. 2 had been killed, 3 wounded, and 1 remained missing, presumed captured. The council chamber, once again filled with raised voices and anxious faces, looked to Cale for a response that would determine the fate of the entire kingdom. "This cannot go unanswered," one of the older generals insisted, slamming his fist against the table. "Garrick has drawn first blood. We must respond in kind, or every rival pack watching will see weakness." "A hasty response could spiral into full conflict," Edmund countered, his voice tight with restrained urgency. "We do not yet know if Garrick ordered this attack directly, or if this was the work of rogue soldiers acting without his authority." Cale stood at the head of the table, his mind racing through every possible consequence of the decisions before him. War would cost countless lives on both sides, would destabilize the peace his father had spent decades building, but inaction risked signaling weakness to every enemy watching from beyond his borders, weakness that could invite far greater threats than Garrick alone. "I want confirmation before we act," Cale said finally, his voice carrying the steady authority his father had once modeled for him. "Send envoys to demand an explanation. If Garrick refuses to answer honestly, or if evidence proves he ordered the attack, we will respond with full force. But I will not launch my kingdom into war based on assumption alone." The council reluctantly agreed, though tension remained thick in the chamber as the meeting concluded. Kale retreated to his private study afterward, the weight of leadership pressing heavily against his shoulders, and it was there that Ren found him hours later, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "I heard about the attack," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "2 soldiers dead," Kale said, staring at the reports spread across his desk without truly seeing them. "Men with families. Men who trusted me to protect this kingdom's peace." Ren moved closer, resting a gentle hand against his shoulder, a gesture that carried more comfort than any words could have offered. "This isn't your fault, Kale." "Isn't it?" he asked bitterly. "If I hadn't handled Lyra's rejection so carelessly, if I hadn't given Garrick an opening to exploit, would any of this have happened?" "You cannot control how others choose to exploit your mistakes," Ren said firmly. "You made an error in judgment, yes, one that hurt someone deeply, but Garrick's ambitions existed long before that night in the Great Hall. He would have found another excuse eventually, if this one hadn't presented itself." Kale studied her for a long moment, grateful for the clarity of her perspective, for her refusal to simply comfort him with empty reassurance, while still holding him accountable for the genuine mistakes he had made. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of honesty he had been missing in every relationship at court, where flattery and careful diplomacy so often replaced genuine truth. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were in my position?" Ren considered the question seriously before answering. "I would seek the truth before acting on assumption, exactly as you've already decided to do. But I would also prepare for the possibility that the truth confirms your worst fears. Hope for peace, but do not let hope leave you unprepared for conflict." Kale nodded slowly, finding wisdom in her words that matched his own instincts, and for the remainder of that tense evening, they worked together, reviewing troop positions, discussing possible strategies should diplomacy fail, Ren's sharp understanding of combat and strategy, proving more valuable than Kale could have anticipated when he first found her wounded in the northern woods. As the days passed, Kale's envoys returned from Garrick's territory with troubling news. Garrick had denied any knowledge of the ambush, claiming it must have been the work of bandits operating independently along the border, though the evidence gathered by Ashbourne scouts told a different story entirely. Weapons recovered from the ambush site bore markings consistent with Garrick's own soldiers, evidence too specific to dismiss as coincidence. The kingdom stood on the edge of war, and within the palace, Kale found himself relying increasingly on Ren's counsel, her steady presence becoming an anchor amid the mounting crisis. Their bond deepened with each passing day, forged not through idle romance but through shared burden, through late nights spent studying maps and strategies together, through quiet moments of comfort exchanged in the aftermath of difficult council meetings. Neither of them yet understood how deeply their futures had already become intertwined, nor how completely the coming conflict would test the fragile trust they had built together within the palace walls. But as autumn deepened around the Ashbourne kingdom, and preparations for potential conflict continued in earnest, both Kale and Ren understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that whatever storm lay ahead, they intended to face it together. Steel rang against steel in the training yard, as Kale drove his sword forward, with a force that made his sparring partner stumble backward, barely raising his blade in time to block the blow. Sweat dripped down Kale's face, despite the cold morning air, his frustration from weeks of political tension finding release in the physical demands of combat practice. "Enough," Edmund called from the edge of the yard, watching with concern as Kale pressed the exhausted soldier further than necessary. "You'll injure him." Kale lowered his blade reluctantly, breathing hard, and offered a brief nod of apology to the soldier, who quickly retreated to catch his breath. "I need the release," Kale admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "You need rest," Edmund countered, approaching with his usual steady calm. "You've barely slept in days, between the council meetings and the border reports." Kale said nothing, knowing his old advisor spoke the truth, though sleep had become increasingly difficult with the weight of an impending conflict pressing against every decision he made. He glanced toward the palace, where he knew Ren would be waiting, likely in the library reviewing the maps they had studied together the previous night, and something in his chest eased slightly at the thought of her steady presence. "There's news," Edmund said, his tone shifting to something more cautious. "Garrick has requested a formal meeting. He proposes a diplomatic resolution before matters escalate further." Kale's eyebrows rose with surprise, though wariness quickly followed. That seems unlike him, given the ambush and his denial of involvement. Perhaps he's testing whether you're prepared for war, Edmund suggested, or perhaps circumstances within his own territory have shifted in ways we don't yet understand. Cale considered this carefully, aware that any decision here carried significant risk. Refusing the meeting could be seen as an act of aggression, while attending carried its own dangers, potential traps, or attempts at further manipulation. Where does he propose we meet? Neutral ground, along the border itself. He suggests bringing minimal escort as a sign of good faith. Minimal escort into potentially hostile territory, Cale repeated skeptically. That sounds less like good faith and more like an invitation to vulnerability. I share your concern, Edmund said, but refusing entirely may only escalate tensions further. Perhaps a compromise, a meeting with sufficient guard to ensure your safety, but not so large a force that it appears as an act of war. Cale nodded slowly, already turning the logistics over in his mind, though his thoughts kept circling back to the danger inherent in trusting anything Garrick proposed. He made his way back toward the palace afterward, finding Wren exactly where he expected, seated at the library table with maps and reports spread before her, her brow furrowed in concentration. Garrick wants a meeting, Cale said, settling into the chair across from her. Wren looked up sharply, her expression immediately wary. That could be a trap. Edmund suspects the same, Cale admitted, but refusing entirely risks escalating tensions we're not yet prepared to fully confront. Wren studied the map before her, tracing the borderline with a careful finger, her sharp mind already working through possible scenarios. If you go, you cannot go without protection sufficient to handle betrayal, should it come to that, but you also cannot bring an army, or you risk provoking exactly the conflict you're trying to avoid. That's exactly the balance Edmund and I discussed, Cale said, impressed once again by how quickly her strategic instincts matched his most trusted advisor's thinking. I want to come with you, Wren said suddenly, her tone leaving little room for argument. Cale frowned, immediate concern rising at the thought of bringing her into potential danger. Absolutely not. If this is a trap, I won't risk your safety. I can handle myself, Wren said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. You've seen that already. And if Garrick has learned of my presence here, my absence from your escort might raise more questions than my presence would. Cale hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the logic of her argument. Why would my traveling with you matter to Garrick? Wren's expression grew troubled, and she hesitated before answering, something clearly weighing on her mind that she had not yet fully shared. Because, if he's learned about my family's history with this territory, about the old debt owed by your family, he might see me as a valuable piece in whatever game he's playing. Better that I'm present, under your protection, than absent and vulnerable to whatever scheme he's constructing. The logic settled uncomfortably in Cale's chest, aware that Wren's reasoning carried weight, even as every instinct in him rebelled against the idea of bringing her into danger. If you come, he said finally, you stay close to me at all times, no exceptions. Wren nodded, a flicker of something like gratitude crossing her features at his reluctant agreement, though the tension of the coming meeting settled heavily over both of them as they finalized preparations over the following days. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and overcast, gray clouds hanging low over the border territory, as Cale's small escort made their way toward the designated meeting point, a clearing marked by an ancient stone marker that had divided Ashbourne territory from neighboring lands for generations. Wren rode close beside him, her posture alert despite the outward calm she maintained, her sharp eyes scanning the tree line with the same wary vigilance Cale recognized from their earliest encounters. Garrick was already waiting when they arrived, flanked by a handful of his own soldiers, his expression carefully neutral as Cale's party approached. Cale dismounted slowly, keeping Wren close beside him, as Edmund and two trusted guards fell into position nearby. Your Majesty, Garrick said, offering a bow that felt more performative than genuine. Thank you for agreeing to meet. You proposed diplomacy, Cale said evenly. I'm willing to hear what you have to say, though the ambush along my border remains unexplained. A regrettable incident, Garrick said smoothly, carried out by rogue elements acting without my authority, as I've already explained through your envoys. I have taken measures to address those responsible. Cale studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, though Garrick's expression remained frustratingly composed. Beside him, Kale felt Ren tense slightly, her attention sharpening as her gaze drifted toward the tree line behind Garrick's escort. "Perhaps we should discuss terms for lasting peace between our territories," Garrick continued, gesturing toward a small table that had been arranged nearby, maps and documents already spread across its surface. "I believe there are mutually beneficial arrangements we could explore." As Kale moved toward the table, his attention fixed on the documents Garrick presented, Ren's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement in the trees beyond the clearing, a glint of metal that shouldn't have been visible if this meeting truly represented nothing more than peaceful negotiation. Her pulse quickened, every instinct honed through years of careful training screaming that something was deeply wrong with the scene unfolding before them. "Kale," she said quietly, urgency creeping into her voice despite her attempt to remain calm, "we need to leave, now." Garrick's composed expression flickered for just a moment, a fraction of a second that confirmed every suspicion racing through Ren's mind. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone carefully innocent, though something colder had crept beneath the surface of his words. Before Kale could respond, the sound of movement erupted from the tree line, dozens of soldiers emerging from concealment, weapons drawn, surrounding the small clearing with terrifying speed and precision. Edmund's hand flew to his sword, the trusted guards immediately closing ranks around Kale and Ren, though the numbers arrayed against them left little room for optimism. "You planned this from the start," Kale said, his voice hardening with barely controlled fury as he stared at Garrick, whatever remained of the diplomatic facade now completely abandoned. "I offered you a chance at peace," Garrick said, his tone shifting into something cold and calculating. "But I've come to realize that a king so easily manipulated by his own poor judgment poses less of a threat removed from power entirely." Kale's blade was in his hand before Garrick finished speaking, his soldiers moving instinctively into defensive formation around him and Ren, though the overwhelming numbers surrounding them made the odds of survival appear grim at best. Ren's hand found the hilt of a blade Edmund had insisted she carry despite her unclear origins, her earlier claims of combat knowledge about to be tested in the most dangerous way imaginable. "Whatever happens," Kale said quietly, positioning himself protectively beside her as Garrick's forces began closing in, "stay close to me." "I intend to," Ren replied, her voice steady, despite the danger surrounding them, her storm-colored eyes hardening with a fierce determination that reminded Kale once again of the remarkable strength hidden beneath her small frame. As the first soldiers surged forward, weapons raised, the fragile peace both kingdoms had maintained for years shattered completely, plunging Kale, Ren, and everyone present into a desperate fight for survival that neither of them could have fully anticipated when they first set out that cold, overcast morning toward what they had believed was nothing more than a diplomatic meeting. Edmund moved first, his blade meeting the closest attacker with the practiced efficiency of decades of experience, buying precious seconds as Kale pulled Ren toward the relative cover of a fallen tree at the clearing's edge. Arrows whistled past them, one embedding itself into the bark inches from Ren's shoulder, and she felt her pulse hammering as every instinct she had spent years honing finally found purpose in the chaos surrounding them. "There," she said sharply, pointing toward a narrow gap in Garrick's formation where the trees grew thick enough to provide cover. "If we can reach that ridge, we can hold a defensible position." Kale nodded, trusting her assessment without hesitation, and together they fought their way through the clearing, his blade cutting down one attacker, while Ren moved with surprising speed, disarming a soldier who lunged toward her with a maneuver that spoke of training far beyond casual self-defense. Whatever mystery surrounded her past, it was clear in this moment that Ren had faced combat before, and faced it well. Edmund fell back toward them, blood streaming from a shallow cut along his arm, though his expression remained fiercely determined. "The ridge," he confirmed, having overheard Ren's suggestion. "It's our best chance." Together, the small group fought their way toward higher ground, the narrow terrain forcing Garrick's larger numbers to funnel through a tighter space, evening the odds slightly, as Kale's remaining soldiers held the line with desperate determination. Kale fought with a ferocity born of pure survival instinct, every strike aimed at protecting the small group around him, especially Ren, who remained close beside him exactly as she had promised. Garrick's voice rang out across the clearing, ordering his soldiers forward with increasing urgency, as he realized his ambush was not unfolding as smoothly as planned. "Take the king alive," he shouted. "Kill the others if necessary." The command sent a fresh wave of fear through Cale's chest, not for himself, but for Ren, whose safety suddenly carried a target that had nothing to do with the political conflict between kingdoms, and everything to do with whatever value Garrick placed on her mysterious lineage. He fought harder, positioning himself between her and every incoming attacker, refusing to let even a single blade come close to reaching her. They reached the ridge just as reinforcements Cale had wisely stationed nearby, anticipating exactly this kind of betrayal despite Garrick's assurances of peaceful negotiation, arrived to turn the tide of the confrontation. Fresh soldiers poured into the clearing, forcing Garrick's forces into a hasty retreat as the balance of power shifted decisively in Cale's favor. Garrick himself vanished into the tree line before Cale could confront him directly, his forces scattering in disarray as Ashbourne reinforcements pressed their advantage. Within minutes, the clearing fell silent except for the labored breathing of exhausted soldiers and the quiet moans of the wounded being tended by healers who had accompanied the reinforcement party. Cale turned immediately to Ren, his hands trembling slightly as adrenaline began to fade, checking her carefully for injuries despite her protests that she remained unharmed. "You saved us," he said, his voice rough with lingering fear and profound relief. "We saved each other," Ren corrected, though the fierce intensity in her eyes had softened into something gentler as she studied his face, equally relieved to find him unharmed. Edmund approached, his wounded arm now bandaged, his expression grave despite their survival. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "Garrick has revealed his true intentions. We cannot pretend diplomacy remains possible after this." Cale nodded grimly, understanding the weight of what had just occurred, understanding that whatever fragile peace had existed between their territories had been shattered beyond repair. But beneath the political implications, a more personal understanding had crystallized within him during those desperate minutes of combat, watching Ren fight beside him with fierce courage and skill, understanding fully now that Garrick's forces had specifically targeted her for capture. "He wanted you," Cale said quietly, once they had begun the journey back toward the palace, the surviving soldiers moving in careful formation around them. "Not just as a bargaining piece against me. He specifically ordered his men to take you alive." Ren's expression grew troubled, confirming that she had heard the same command and understood its implications far better than Cale himself. "The old debt," she said quietly, "the history between our families. If Garrick has learned of it, he may believe my lineage carries some kind of political or symbolic value he could use against you. Then we need to understand exactly what that history entails," Cale said firmly, "before Garrick finds another way to use it against us." Ren nodded slowly, though something in her expression suggested she already carried suspicions about the true nature of her family's connection to Ashbourne territory, suspicions she had not yet fully shared even with Cale, despite the trust that had grown so significantly between them over the preceding weeks. As their party continued the journey back toward the safety of the palace walls, both of them understood that the danger they had narrowly survived was far from over, and that the coming days would demand answers to questions neither of them yet fully understood. Blood stained the infirmary floor as healers rushed between wounded soldiers, the aftermath of Garrick's betrayal stretching long into the night as the palace worked to treat the injured and account for those who had not survived the ambush. Cale moved through the chaos with grim purpose, checking on each of his soldiers personally, offering words of gratitude and comfort, even as exhaustion pulled heavily at his own body. Ren worked alongside the healers without needing to be asked, her steady hands cleaning wounds and applying bandages with practiced efficiency that once again confirmed the depth of training she carried beneath her guarded exterior. It was well past midnight before the immediate crisis eased enough for either of them to finally rest, retreating together to Cale's private study, where a fire crackled softly against the lingering chill of the terrible day. 3 soldiers lost, Cale said quietly, staring into the flames. "Good men who trusted me to lead them safely. You couldn't have known Garrick would break the terms of diplomatic meetings so completely," Ren said, settling into the chair beside him. "This betrayal falls on him, not you." Cale said nothing for a long moment, the weight of leadership pressing heavily against his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness he rarely allowed himself to show. "Every decision I make ripples outward. affecting lives I'm responsible for protecting. The rejection of Lyra, this failed meeting with Garrick. I keep making choices that put others at risk. You're being too hard on yourself, Ren said firmly, turning to face him directly. Leadership means making difficult choices with incomplete information. You cannot control every consequence, only your intentions and your willingness to learn from mistakes. Kale studied her carefully, struck once again by the wisdom she offered so freely, despite her own guarded nature about her past. How did you become so wise about leadership, for someone who claims no formal position of power? Something flickered across Ren's expression, a hesitation that suggested she was weighing how much more truth to share. My grandmother, she said finally. She led our people for many years, after we were displaced from this territory generations ago. She taught me everything she knew about carrying responsibility for others, about the weight that comes with protecting a community. Your people, Kale repeated carefully. You've mentioned this before, but never explained fully. Who exactly are your people, Ren? Ren was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the fire, and Kale sensed that whatever answer she was about to give carried significance far beyond simple family history. We are descendants of the original Omega lineage that once held this land, before your ancestors claimed it through conflict, generations ago. My grandmother always believed that one day, someone from our bloodline would need to return here, to reclaim what history had taken from us, or at least to understand it fully. The revelation settled heavily in the quiet study, and Kale found himself processing not just the historical weight of her words, but the deeper implication that Ren's presence in the northern woods had never been entirely coincidental. Is that why you came here? To reclaim something? I came because my grandmother asked me to, before she passed, Ren said, her voice carrying quiet grief beneath the words. She never told me exactly what she hoped I would find, only that this land held answers our family had been searching for, across many generations. Kale absorbed this slowly, understanding now why Garrick's soldiers had been ordered to take her alive, why her lineage carried political and symbolic weight beyond simple personal history. Garrick believes your bloodline could be used against my claim to this throne, he said slowly, the pieces finally settling into place. It's possible, Ren admitted. Ancient claims to land and title carry weight in some traditions, even generations later. If Garrick can prove my family's original claim to this territory predates your family's rule, he could use that history to challenge your legitimacy, or to negotiate favorable terms by threatening to support a rival claim. The political implications were staggering, and Kale found himself torn between concern for the stability of his kingdom and a growing, deeper understanding of exactly what Ren had sacrificed by choosing to remain honest with him, despite the risk her truth carried. You could have used this information yourself, he said slowly. You could have leveraged your family's claim against me, rather than simply telling me the truth. That was never my intention, Ren said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. My grandmother wanted understanding, not conquest. And whatever history exists between our families, I have no desire to see it used as a weapon against you, or against the people you're responsible for protecting. Something in Kale's chest eased at her words, a trust deepening between them that felt more solid than anything he had experienced with anyone else at court. Then, let's find the truth together, he said. Whatever history connects our families, I want to understand it fully, and I want to make right whatever wrongs occurred, if that's possible. Over the following days, as the palace slowly recovered from the aftermath of Garrick's betrayal, Kale and Ren spent long hours together in the archives, searching through ancient records and family histories that had been carefully preserved but rarely examined in recent generations. Edmund joined their research when his duties allowed, his own extensive knowledge of Pack history proving invaluable as they pieced together a clearer picture of the conflict that had displaced Ren's ancestors generations earlier. What they discovered painted a far more complicated picture than either Kale or Ren had initially anticipated. The conflict that had driven Ren's family from this territory had not been a simple conquest, but a complex political struggle involving multiple parties, including an ancestor of Garrick's own bloodline, who had played a significant role in the events that ultimately led to the displacement of Ren's people. This changes things considerably, Edmund said, studying an old document that detailed the terms of a treaty signed generations earlier. According to this record, your family's ancestors, Ren, were promised compensation and eventual return to this territory once the conflict settled. That promise was never fulfilled. Ren's expression grew troubled as she absorbed this information. Old family stories finally finding confirmation in these ancient records. My grandmother always suspected there had been a broken promise, but she never had proof. This gives us proof, Cale said firmly, already turning over possibilities in his mind. It also gives us leverage against Garrick, whose own family's involvement in this old conflict could prove damaging to his current political standing, should this history become widely known. Edmund nodded slowly, though his expression remained cautious. This is a delicate situation. Revealing this history could strengthen your position against Garrick, but it also raises questions about your own family's failure to honor the original treaty terms across so many generations. Cale understood the complexity immediately, aware that righting old wrongs while protecting his kingdom's stability required careful, thoughtful action rather than hasty decisions. Then we proceed carefully, he said, but we proceed with honesty. Ren's family deserves acknowledgement of this broken promise, regardless of how it affects the current political situation with Garrick. Ren studied him with an expression of genuine gratitude and quiet awe, watching as Cale, once the king who had callously rejected someone based on shallow judgment of size, now demonstrated a willingness to confront uncomfortable historical truths and make amends for wrongs his own family had committed generations earlier. "Thank you," she said softly, "for taking this seriously, rather than dismissing it as inconvenient history." "You deserve nothing less," Cale replied, reaching out to take her hand gently. "And honestly, uncovering this truth has taught me more about genuine leadership than any lesson I received in my formal education, preparing to become king." As their research continued, drawing them closer together through shared purpose and mutual respect, word slowly began spreading through the palace about the historical connection between the young king and the mysterious stranger he had brought back from the northern woods months earlier. The court's earlier suspicion and curiosity gradually transformed into genuine interest, as details of Ren's remarkable lineage and the broken promises of the past began circulating among the nobles, many of whom found themselves surprisingly moved by the young king's commitment to acknowledging and correcting historical wrongs. But not everyone within the palace walls viewed these developments favorably. Among the council members, whispers of concern began circulating about the political implications of publicly acknowledging such a significant historical debt, concerns that Cale would need to address carefully as he balanced his growing personal connection to Ren against the practical realities of ruling a kingdom, still recovering from Garrick's recent betrayal, and the lingering tension of an unresolved conflict along the southern border. A week after the discovery in the archives, Cale called a formal council session to address the matter directly, aware that secrecy would only invite further speculation and mistrust. He stood before the assembled nobles, Ren seated quietly nearby, as he laid out the historical evidence Edmund had helped compile. "Generations ago," Cale began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal, "my ancestors made a promise to the Omega lineage that once held claim to portions of this territory. That promise, recorded clearly in treaty documents preserved in our own archives, was never honored." Murmurs rippled through the council chamber, some nobles exchanging uneasy glances, others leaning forward with obvious interest. One of the older council members, a stern woman named Cordelia who had served on the council since Cale's father's rule, rose slowly to her feet. "Your Majesty, with respect, why raise this matter now? These events occurred many generations past. What purpose does reopening old wounds serve, especially while we remain vulnerable following Garrick's recent betrayal?" "Because honesty and accountability matter," Cale replied firmly, "regardless of how much time has passed. I have learned recently, through painful experience, the cost of dismissing people's worth or history, simply because doing so proves convenient." His gaze flickered briefly toward Ren as he spoke, and several members of the council followed his glance, understanding settling across their expressions as they connected his words to his recent rejection of Lyra and his subsequent close relationship with the mysterious stranger now seated among them. "What exactly do you propose, Your Majesty?" Another council member asked cautiously. "Formal acknowledgement of the broken treaty," Cale said, "along with appropriate compensation to Ren's family line, and public recognition of the historical wrong committed against her ancestors. I will not allow old debts to remain buried simply because uncovering them proves politically inconvenient." The chamber fell into tense discussion, council members debating the implications of Cale's proposal, some expressing genuine support for righting historical wrongs, others voicing concern about the precedent such acknowledgement might set, or the vulnerability it might expose during an already unstable political period. Wren remained quiet throughout the debate, her expression carefully composed despite the weight of having her family's entire history discussed so openly before strangers. Edmund finally spoke, his measured voice cutting through the competing arguments with practiced authority. "I have reviewed the historical documents personally. The evidence is clear and undeniable. Whatever political risk acknowledgement carries, the alternative, continuing to ignore a documented broken promise, undermines the very foundation of honor and integrity this kingdom claims to uphold." His words carried significant weight among the council, many of whom respected Edmund's judgment above nearly anyone else in the kingdom, aside from Cale himself. Slowly, the tide of debate shifted, and by the session's conclusion, the council had agreed, albeit with some reluctance from certain members, to support Cale's proposal for formal acknowledgement and appropriate compensation. As the council session concluded and members began filing out of the chamber, Cordelia approached Wren directly, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "Your family endured a genuine injustice," she said quietly. "I apologize that it took so long, and required such difficult circumstances, for that truth to finally receive proper acknowledgement." Wren accepted the apology graciously, though something in her expression suggested the weight of generations of her family's displacement could not be fully resolved through a single council session, however meaningful. "Thank you," she said simply. "It means more than you know, to see this history finally taken seriously." Later that evening, as the palace settled into quiet after the eventful council session, Cale found Wren in the gardens, standing beside the same fountain where their relationship had first begun to deepen weeks earlier. He approached slowly, giving her space to process the significant developments of the day. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, settling beside her. "Overwhelmed," Wren admitted. "My grandmother spent her entire life hoping for this kind of acknowledgement, and she never lived to see it happen. Part of me wishes she could have been here today." "She would be proud of you," Cale said softly, "for your courage in sharing this history, even knowing the risk it carried." Wren turned to study him carefully, something warm and grateful settling into her expression. "You didn't have to fight for this acknowledgement, Cale. You could have kept my family's history buried, avoided the political complications entirely. I couldn't do that," Cale said firmly. "Not after everything I've learned about the cost of dismissing someone's worth, someone's history, simply because acknowledging the truth proves inconvenient. I made that mistake once already, with devastating consequences for someone who deserved far better from me." The mention of Lyra hung quietly between them, an acknowledgement of the painful history that had shaped Cale's growth over these recent months. Wren reached out, taking his hand gently in her own, offering silent understanding rather than judgment. "You're not the same person who stood in that great hall months ago," she said quietly. "You've grown, Cale. Genuinely grown, in ways that matter." Cale studied their joined hands, feeling a warmth settle deep in his chest at her words, at the quiet acceptance and understanding she offered so freely, despite everything complicated history connected their two families. "I have you to thank for much of that growth," he admitted. "Your honesty, your refusal to simply flatter or defer to my position, has taught me more about genuine leadership than years of formal preparation ever did." They remained in the garden long into the evening, the weight of the day's revelations settling into something quieter and more peaceful between them, a foundation of trust and mutual respect that had grown steadily stronger through every challenge they had faced together since that fateful night Cale found her wounded in the northern woods. Neither of them yet knew what challenges still lay ahead, what schemes Garrick and Lyra continued weaving beyond the palace walls. But in this quiet moment, surrounded by the familiar comfort of the gardens, both Cale and Wren felt something solid and enduring taking root between them, a bond built not on convenience or political necessity, but on genuine understanding and hard-won trust. A hooded figure slipped through the servants' entrance of the palace just past midnight, moving with practiced familiarity through corridors she had once walked freely as the king's intended mate. Lyra kept her face concealed, her heart pounding as she navigated toward the private chambers of a sympathetic noble who had agreed to grant her brief, secret access to the palace grounds. She had told herself, repeatedly during the journey back from Garrick's territory, that this visit served purely practical purposes, gathering information to strengthen the alliance she had reluctantly forged. But standing now in the familiar halls where she had once imagined her future unfolding as queen, Lyra felt old grief rising sharply alongside colder, more calculating thoughts. The noble, a minor lord named Percival who harbored his own grievances against Chaol's recent policy decisions, met her in a private study, his expression nervous, despite his earlier agreement to assist her. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered urgently. "If the guards discover you within the palace walls, the consequences could be severe." "I won't stay long," Lyra assured him. "I simply need information about the king's recent activities, particularly regarding the stranger he brought back from the northern woods months ago." Percival hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, though his own resentment toward certain council decisions ultimately outweighed his caution. "The council recently acknowledged some kind of historical debt owed to her family," he said. "There was significant discussion, some support, some opposition. The king seems genuinely committed to the acknowledgement, regardless of political cost." Lyra absorbed this information carefully, her mind already calculating how such developments might affect the fragile alliance she maintained with Garrick. "What do people say about their relationship, the king and this stranger?" "The court whispers of genuine affection," Percival admitted reluctantly. "Some believe they may be approaching a formal bond, though nothing has been announced publicly." The words landed like a physical blow, and Lyra found herself struggling to maintain her composed exterior, despite the sharp pain lancing through her chest. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that her feelings toward Chaol had curdled entirely into calculated ambition, that revenge alone motivated her continued involvement with Garrick's schemes. But hearing confirmation that Chaol had moved on so completely, finding genuine connection with someone else so soon after her humiliating rejection, reopened wounds she had believed were beginning to heal. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil beneath the surface. "This information proves useful." She left the palace grounds as quietly as she had entered, making her way back toward the small camp where Garrick's forces had regrouped following their failed ambush weeks earlier. Garrick himself waited for her return, his expression carefully neutral as she relayed the information she had gathered. "A genuine bond forming," Garrick mused, studying a map spread across the table before him. "This complicates matters considerably, though it also presents new opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" Lyra asked warily, uncertain she wanted to hear his answer. "If this stranger's lineage truly carries legitimate claim to Ashbourne territory, and if the king intends to formally bond with her, we may be able to exploit the political instability such a union would create among the more traditional factions within his own court. Not everyone will welcome such a significant shift in power and precedent." Lyra studied him carefully, aware that Garrick's calculations had grown increasingly cold and detached from any concern for genuine justice or fairness, focused entirely on exploiting whatever weakness or vulnerability presented itself for his own political gain. The realization settled uncomfortably in her chest, a growing awareness that she had allied herself with someone whose ambitions extended far beyond simple retribution against the king who had wronged her. "I want no part in further violence," she said firmly. "Our agreement was political pressure, not continued military aggression." Garrick's expression flickered with something calculating, though he offered a placating smile that did little to ease Lyra's growing unease. "Of course," he said smoothly, "political maneuvering alone should prove sufficient, particularly if we can position certain traditional council members against this unprecedented union." Lyra nodded slowly, though doubt continued gnawing at her conscience as she considered the direction their alliance was taking. She had wanted Chaol to understand the pain his careless rejection had caused her, had wanted acknowledgement of the injustice she suffered in that great hall. But watching Garrick calculate every piece of information as a weapon to be exploited, she began to wonder whether her desire for justice had led her into an alliance far more dangerous and morally compromised than she had initially anticipated. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, unaware of the secret visit that had occurred under cover of darkness, Chaol and Ren continued growing closer with each passing day, their bond deepening through shared purpose and mutual understanding that had been forged through genuine hardship rather than simple convenience. Edmund observed their growing connection with quiet approval, though he remained watchful for any sign of the political complications he knew would inevitably arise as their relationship continued to develop. "The council has scheduled a formal ceremony," Edmund informed Chaol one afternoon, "to publicly acknowledge the historical debt owed to Wren's family, and to formally welcome her lineage back into recognized standing within the kingdom's history." Chaol nodded, aware of the significance such a ceremony carried, both for Wren's family history and for the growing public perception of their relationship. "When is it scheduled?" 2 weeks from now," Edmund said. "Sufficient time to prepare properly, and to ensure the ceremony carries the dignity and significance this acknowledgement deserves." Chaol found Wren later that day, sharing the news of the upcoming ceremony, watching carefully for her reaction to such a significant public acknowledgement of her family's long-buried history. "This is real," she said softly, something like disbelief coloring her voice. "After everything my grandmother hoped for, everything my family endured, it's finally happening." "You deserve this recognition," Chaol said firmly, "and I intend to ensure the ceremony reflects the genuine significance of what your family sacrificed, and what this kingdom owes in return." Wren studied him with an expression of profound gratitude, though something more complicated flickered briefly behind her eyes, a hesitation Chaol couldn't quite identify. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Something I've been thinking about since we discovered the truth of my family's history." "What is it?" Chaol asked, giving her his full attention. "The old treaty specified compensation, formal acknowledgement, and eventual return of certain rights to my family's lineage," Wren said carefully. "But some of the older texts we discovered also reference something else, a formal bond between the ruling family and the Omega lineage, intended to permanently unite the two bloodlines and prevent future conflict." Chaol's breath caught slightly at the implication, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. "You're saying the original treaty anticipated a formal mating bond between our families?" "It's possible," Wren said, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty, despite the significance of the revelation. "The language is somewhat ambiguous, open to interpretation, but if true, it would explain why Garrick believed my lineage carried such significant political weight, worth the risk of ambushing us during that failed diplomatic meeting." Chaol absorbed this information slowly, aware that whatever historical implications existed, his growing feelings toward Wren had developed independently of any ancient treaty obligation. "Regardless of what the old texts suggest," he said firmly, "my feelings toward you have nothing to do with fulfilling some ancient political arrangement. I care for you because of who you are, not because of any historical debt or treaty obligation." Something in Wren's expression softened at his words, gratitude and relief mixing with the growing warmth that had been building steadily between them for weeks. "I needed to hear that," she admitted quietly. "I've worried, sometimes, whether our connection was genuine, or simply the natural result of circumstances pushing us together." "It's genuine," Chaol said firmly, reaching out to take her hand. "More genuine than anything else in my life since taking this crown." As their bond continued deepening in the weeks leading toward the formal ceremony, neither Chaol nor Wren remained fully aware of the quiet schemes continuing to unfold beyond the palace walls, where Lyra's growing unease about Garrick's calculating ambitions warred increasingly against her own lingering desire for justice and acknowledgement. The formal ceremony approaching would mark a significant turning point, not only in Wren's long-buried family history, but in the broader political landscape of the entire kingdom, drawing every hidden tension and unresolved conflict steadily toward a confrontation none of the involved parties could yet fully anticipate. Preparations for the ceremony consumed much of the palace's attention over the following days, servants arranging decorations throughout the great hall, the same hall where Chaol had once delivered his cruel rejection of Lyra, now being transformed into a space intended to honor, rather than humiliate. Chaol found the symbolism unsettling at times, aware of the painful irony that the location of his greatest mistake would now host a ceremony celebrating growth and acknowledgement of past wrongs. Wren spent much of her time in quiet reflection, writing letters to distant relatives, who still remembered fragments of her family's displaced history, hoping to gather additional details that might enrich the formal acknowledgement ceremony. One evening, she found herself in the palace archives once more, searching through older, more obscure records that Edmund had recently uncovered during his continued research into the treaty's full historical context. "You've been here for hours," Chaol said, finding her surrounded by scattered documents, candlelight flickering across her tired but focused features. I keep finding new details, Ren said, gesturing toward a particularly worn document spread before her. This one describes the original ceremony my ancestors performed when they first settled this territory, generations before your family's rise to power. The traditions are beautiful, actually. I wonder if some of them might be incorporated into our own ceremony. Kale moved closer, studying the faded illustrations depicting an ancient gathering, symbols and traditions he had never encountered in his own formal education about pack history. These traditions were lost when your family was displaced? Most of them, Ren said, a touch of sadness coloring her voice. My grandmother remembered fragments, passed down through oral history, but so much detail was lost when our people scattered generations ago. Then let's honor what remains, Kale said firmly. Incorporate whatever traditions you can recover into the ceremony. This should celebrate your family's history authentically, not simply follow whatever formal protocol my own family's traditions dictate. Ren looked up at him with genuine warmth, moved by his willingness to prioritize authentic acknowledgement over convenient tradition. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding how much this matters. They spent the remainder of that evening together, poring over the ancient documents, Ren explaining what fragments of tradition she remembered from her grandmother's teachings. Kale, listening with genuine interest and respect, occasionally offering suggestions for how such traditions might be respectfully woven into the formal ceremony, without losing their original significance and meaning. As the ceremony date approached, word of the upcoming acknowledgement spread throughout the kingdom, reaching villages and territories far beyond the palace walls. Many among the common people, who had long felt disconnected from the formal politics of court, found themselves genuinely moved by the story of a king willing to publicly acknowledge his family's historical wrongs and make meaningful amends, rather than simply burying inconvenient truths to protect his own political standing. But not everyone within the kingdom viewed these developments favorably. Among certain traditionalist factions, quiet grumbling began circulating about the wisdom of formally elevating an unknown stranger's family history to such prominent significance, concerns that found sympathetic ears among those already predisposed to resent the growing influence Ren held over the young king's decisions. These murmurs of discontent, though not yet significant enough to threaten the ceremony's planned proceedings, provided exactly the kind of political opening Garrick and Lyra had hoped to exploit, a fracture within Ashbourne's own court that might yet be widened into something far more destabilizing, should the right pressure be applied, at precisely the right moment. The great hall overflowed with nobles, common folk, and dignitaries from neighboring territories, every seat filled and every standing space claimed, as the kingdom gathered to witness the formal ceremony acknowledging Ren's long-buried family history. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the same marble floor where Kale had once delivered his devastating rejection of Lyra, now transformed by garlands of flowers and banners, bearing symbols Ren had carefully recovered from her family's ancient traditions. Ren stood at the center of the hall, dressed in deep green fabric, embroidered with patterns representing her family's original lineage, her posture steady, despite the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. Kale stood beside her, dressed in formal royal attire, his expression carrying none of the cold detachment that had marked his demeanor during his rejection of Lyra months earlier. Instead, genuine warmth and respect radiated from him as he prepared to address the assembled crowd. Generations ago, Kale began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, my ancestors made a promise to the Omega lineage that once held rightful claim to portions of this territory. That promise was broken, and the consequences of that broken promise echoed across generations, displacing an entire people from the land they called home. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle across the crowd before continuing. Today, I stand before you not simply as king, but as someone determined to right this historical wrong. Ren, whose courage and wisdom have taught me more about genuine leadership than any lesson from my formal education, represents the rightful continuation of that displaced lineage. The crowd remained silent, absorbing the significance of his words, and Kale turned to face Ren directly, his expression softening into something deeply personal, despite the formal nature of the ceremony. I formally acknowledge the debt owed to your family, he said, and I commit, as king of this territory, to ensuring your lineage receives the recognition, compensation, and respect it has been denied for far too long. Ren felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment, by the knowledge that her grandmother's lifelong hope had finally found fulfillment, even if she had not lived to witness it herself. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent hall despite its quiet volume. "On behalf of my family, and everyone who came before me, thank you for taking this history seriously." As Edmund stepped forward to present the formal documents confirming the treaty's acknowledgement and the compensation terms the council had agreed upon, something unexpected began happening between Cale and Ren, a sensation neither of them had fully anticipated despite the growing closeness they had shared over recent months. As their eyes met across the small distance separating them, a warmth unlike anything either had experienced before began building rapidly between them, an intensity that seemed to pull at something deep and instinctive within both their bodies. Ren's breath caught sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for Cale's as an overwhelming pull settled deep into her chest, unlike anything she had encountered even during her closest moments with him previously. Cale felt it too, a sensation that seemed to synchronize his heartbeat with hers, an awareness of her presence that suddenly felt as fundamental and necessary as breathing itself. "Cale," Ren whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you feel that?" "Yes," he said, equally stunned by the intensity of the sensation washing over him. "What is happening?" Edmund, standing nearby with the formal documents still in hand, froze as he witnessed the unmistakable signs unfolding before the entire assembled court. He had read about such occurrences in ancient texts, had heard stories passed down through generations, but had never personally witnessed what was clearly happening between the young king and Ren in this very moment. "A mating bond," Edmund said, his voice carrying enough volume that those nearest to him could hear clearly, the words rippling outward through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. "A true mating bond, forming here, before us all." Gasps rippled through the great hall, nobles and common folk alike straining to witness this extraordinary event, an occurrence so rare that most present had only heard of such bonds through ancient stories, rather than personal experience. True mating bonds, spontaneous and undeniable, connecting two souls with a certainty that transcended simple attraction or growing affection, were said to occur perhaps once in several generations, marking a connection considered by ancient tradition to be blessed by forces beyond simple mortal choice. Cale turned fully toward Ren, everything else in the crowded hall fading into insignificance, as the overwhelming sensation of connection deepened between them. Her scent, which had first captured his attention that fateful night in the northern woods, now surrounded him completely, wrapping around his senses with an intensity that left him breathless. "I feel like I've known you my entire life," Ren said softly, tears streaming freely down her face now, though they carried none of the pain that had marked her earlier tears in this very hall, replaced instead by overwhelming joy and wonder. "Like some part of me has been waiting for this moment, without even realizing it." "I feel the same," Cale said, reaching up to gently brush away her tears, his own eyes bright with emotion. He made no attempt to hide from the watching crowd. "Whatever this connection is, I've never experienced anything like it in my entire life." Edmund, recovering his composure, addressed the crowd formally, his voice carrying the weight of someone witnessing genuine history unfolding before him. "Ancient tradition holds that true mating bonds, spontaneous and undeniable as this one clearly is, represent the strongest possible connection between two souls, a bond considered sacred and unbreakable by every tradition our kingdom has ever recognized." The crowd erupted into a mixture of astonished murmurs and genuine celebration. Many among the common folk moved to tears themselves by witnessing such a rare and significant event unfolding within their own great hall. The ceremony, originally intended simply to acknowledge historical wrongs and formal treaty obligations, had transformed unexpectedly into something far more profound and significant, a moment that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come throughout Ashbourne territory. Cale turned to face the crowd, still holding Ren's hand tightly in his own, understanding intuitively that this moment demanded acknowledgement beyond the simple formal proceedings originally planned for the day. "It seems," he said, his voice carrying warmth and genuine wonder despite the formal setting, "that history has given us more than simple acknowledgement of past wrongs today. It has given us a future neither Ren nor I could have anticipated when this ceremony began." The crowd's celebration grew louder, genuine joy replacing the earlier solemn tension that had marked the beginning of the ceremony, and Cale found himself smiling more freely and genuinely than he had in longer than he could remember, the weight of his earlier mistakes finally beginning to feel like distant history rather than an ever-present burden weighing against his every decision. Amid the celebration, however, not every face in the crowd reflected genuine joy. Cordelia, the stern council member who had initially questioned the wisdom of publicly acknowledging Wren's family history, watched the unfolding scene with an expression of careful calculation rather than simple celebration. A true mating bond carried significant political implications beyond simple personal happiness, implications that would need careful navigation in the weeks and months ahead as the kingdom adjusted to this unprecedented development. Similarly, word of the extraordinary event spread quickly beyond the palace walls, carried by traveling merchants and messengers toward every corner of the kingdom, and eventually, toward Garrick's territory as well, where the news reached Lyra through one of her remaining contacts within the court, just days after the ceremony concluded. Lyra read the messenger's account with trembling hands, the words describing an undeniable mating bond forming between Cale and Wren, landing with a finality that shattered whatever lingering hope she had unconsciously maintained about eventually reclaiming her position within Ashbourne's court. A mating bond, unlike a simple political arrangement or growing personal affection, represented a connection that could not be undone, could not be challenged or reversed through any political maneuvering, however clever or persistent. "This is significant," Garrick said, studying the report Lyra had shared with him, his expression calculating despite the seemingly insurmountable obstacle the news presented to their earlier plans. "A true mating bond will complicate our political strategy considerably. The court will rally behind such a rare and sacred occurrence, making any challenge to the king's judgment or authority far more difficult to sustain." Lyra said nothing for a long moment, staring at the report, feeling something inside her finally, completely breaking in a way that felt different from the initial pain of her rejection months earlier. That pain had been sharp and immediate, but this news carried a different kind of grief, an acknowledgement that whatever future she had once imagined for herself within Ashbourne's court had truly and permanently ended. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "it's time to reconsider our approach entirely." Garrick studied her carefully, sensing the shift in her resolve, though his own ambitions remained undeterred by the setback. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Lyra said, her voice growing steadier as some clarity finally settled over her scattered emotions, "that perhaps continuing to seek revenge against a bond that clearly carries the blessing of forces beyond simple political calculation serves no genuine purpose beyond satisfying old wounds that would be better left to heal." Garrick's expression hardened slightly at her words, clearly displeased by the shift in her commitment to their alliance, though he said nothing immediately, choosing instead to study her with renewed calculation, already considering how he might proceed with his own ambitions, regardless of whether Lyra remained a willing participant in his schemes. Back within the palace, unaware of the quiet reconsideration occurring within Garrick's camp, Cale and Wren spent the days following the ceremony adjusting to the profound significance of their newly formed bond, a connection that carried weight and permanence neither of them had fully anticipated when their unlikely journey together first began, in the quiet aftermath of Cale's public rejection of Lyra months earlier. "I never imagined this," Wren admitted one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens, their hands naturally intertwined in a way that felt as though it had always belonged there. "When I first woke in your infirmary, wounded and uncertain, I never imagined my life would lead to this moment." "Neither did I," Cale admitted, "though looking back now, I wonder if some part of me recognized something significant the very first moment I found you in those northern woods." Wren smiled softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as they continued their walk through the quiet gardens, the weight of their formal bond settling comfortably into place between them, a foundation built not on convenient political arrangement, but on genuine understanding, hard-won trust, and a connection that ancient tradition itself recognized as sacred and undeniable. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever schemes Garrick continued weaving beyond the palace walls, both Cale and Wren understood, with quiet certainty, that they would face the future together, bound by something far stronger than either of them had ever anticipated finding within their own lives. The days following the ceremony brought a wave of celebration throughout Ashbourne territory, unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in years. Villages held their own smaller festivities, common folk sharing stories of the rare mating bond that had formed before the entire court, many finding in the tale a renewed sense of hope and connection to traditions that had grown increasingly distant in recent generations. Merchants reported that even trade negotiations with neighboring territories, wary of Ashbourne's recent conflict with Garrick, seemed to soften somewhat in light of the news, as though the sacred nature of the bond lent unexpected credibility and goodwill to Cale's rule. Within the palace itself, preparations began for a formal bonding celebration, a grander event intended to properly honor the significance of what had occurred, distinct from the treaty acknowledgement ceremony that had inadvertently triggered the bond's formation. Wren found herself swept into a whirlwind of planning, meeting with representatives from various noble houses, each eager to contribute to the celebration, in hopes of securing favor with the newly bonded couple. Amid the excitement, Cale made a point of setting aside quiet time each day for himself and Wren, understanding intuitively that the overwhelming public attention risked overshadowing the deeply personal significance of what they had experienced together in that hall. He found her one afternoon in a quieter corner of the palace, away from the bustling preparations, examining a collection of old family artifacts that had been recovered and returned to her as part of the formal acknowledgement. "These belong to your ancestors," Cale said softly, settling beside her as she studied a delicate silver pendant, engraved with symbols matching those she had described from the ancient texts. "My grandmother spoke of a pendant like this," Wren said, her voice hushed with wonder. "She always believed it had been lost forever when our family was displaced. I never imagined I would see anything like it with my own eyes." Cale watched her carefully, moved by the quiet joy reflected in her expression, understanding that moments like this, small and personal, mattered as much as the grand public ceremonies and celebrations unfolding around them. "There are more artifacts in the archive," he said. "Whatever remains of your family's history within these walls belongs to you now, fully and completely." Wren looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, though these carried nothing but gratitude and joy. "You've given me back a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing," she said softly. "My entire life, I felt like an outsider, someone without roots, without a place that truly belonged to me. Now, for the first time, I feel like I understand exactly where I come from, and exactly where I belong." "You belong here," Cale said firmly, taking her hand gently in his own. "Not because of any ancient treaty or historical debt, but because this is where you choose to be, and because this is where I want you to remain, for as long as you're willing to stay." Their quiet moment was interrupted gently by Edmund, who approached with careful respect for the intimacy of the scene before him, though the urgency in his expression suggested matters requiring immediate attention. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but Cordelia has requested a private audience. She wishes to discuss certain concerns regarding the political implications of the bond before matters progress further." Cale's expression grew slightly guarded, aware that Cordelia's concerns, however carefully phrased, likely reflected broader anxieties circulating among the more traditional factions within his court. "Send her to my study within the hour," he said. "I'll address her concerns directly." Wren watched him rise, a flicker of worry crossing her own expression despite the joy of recent days. "Do you think there will be significant opposition to our bond?" "There may be some resistance," Cale admitted honestly, unwilling to offer false reassurance despite his desire to protect her from unnecessary worry. Change of this magnitude rarely comes without some measure of concern from those invested in maintaining familiar traditions. But I intend to address any concerns directly and honestly, exactly as we've approached every challenge we've faced together thus far." Wren nodded, though the worry remained visible in her expression, as Cale departed to prepare for his meeting with Cordelia. She understood, perhaps more acutely than Cale himself, how quickly political goodwill could shift, how easily celebration could transform into suspicion and resentment when circumstances changed or new information emerged. Her own family's history, buried and forgotten for generations despite its documented truth, stood as painful testament to how easily inconvenient realities could be dismissed or manipulated by those holding power and influence. As Cale made his way toward his study to address Cordelia's concerns, and as celebration continued unfolding throughout the kingdom, in response to the extraordinary bond formed before the entire court, Neither he nor Wren yet understood how significantly their growing happiness would soon be tested by forces both within and beyond the palace walls, forces already beginning to stir in response to the profound shift the bond represented within Ashbourne's political landscape. A sealed letter arrived at the palace gates just before dawn, delivered by a courier who refused to identify who had sent him, before disappearing back into the shadows of the early morning streets. The guard who received it recognized the wax seal immediately, a mark belonging to one of the oldest and most influential noble families within Ashbourne territory, and carried it directly to Edmund, rather than risking any delay in delivering something so clearly urgent. Edmund's expression darkened as he read the letter's contents, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger by the time he reached the final line. He made his way immediately toward Cale's private chambers, finding him already awake, reviewing morning reports alongside Wren, who had taken to assisting with certain administrative duties in the weeks since their bond had formed. "This arrived moments ago," Edmund said, extending the letter without preamble. "You need to see it immediately." Cale took the letter, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine alarm as he read through its contents. The letter, signed by several prominent noble families, questioned the legitimacy of Wren's claimed lineage, suggesting that the historical documents used to justify the treaty acknowledgement and subsequent ceremony had been fabricated or manipulated to serve some hidden political agenda. It further suggested, in carefully veiled language, that the mating bond itself might have been artificially induced through some form of manipulation, rather than occurring naturally, as ancient tradition described. "This is absurd," Cale said, his voice tight with anger, as he handed the letter to Wren, who read through it with growing distress. "Mating bonds cannot be artificially induced. Every scholar and healer in this kingdom would confirm that immediately." "But questioning it plants doubt, regardless of the truth," Wren said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she set the letter down. "This isn't really about the bond itself. It's about undermining my legitimacy, and by extension, undermining your judgment as king." Edmund nodded grimly, confirming her assessment. "The signatures on this letter represent significant influence within the council. If they choose to pursue this challenge publicly, it could create serious political instability, regardless of how baseless the accusations actually are." Cale's mind raced through possible responses, understanding that dismissing the letter outright risked appearing defensive or evasive, while engaging with its accusations directly risked lending them unwarranted credibility. "Who do we suspect is behind orchestrating this challenge?" "The signatures suggest genuine concern from traditionalist factions," Edmund said carefully, "but the timing and coordination suggest someone experienced in political maneuvering guided their concerns into this formal challenge. This has the calculated precision of Garrick's influence, even if his name appears nowhere on the document itself." Wren's expression grew troubled as she considered the implications. "If Garrick orchestrated this from beyond our borders, he must have allies within the court itself, individuals willing to lend their names and influence to challenge the legitimacy of our bond. We need to identify those allies," Cale said firmly, "and we need to address this challenge directly, before it gains further momentum among the council." Over the following days, tension within the palace grew increasingly palpable, as word of the formal challenge spread among the nobles, reigniting old debates about the wisdom of publicly acknowledging Wren's family history, and the unprecedented nature of the mating bond that had formed before the entire court. Some nobles rallied firmly behind Cale, defending the legitimacy of both the historical acknowledgement and the bond itself, while others, emboldened by the formal letter, began voicing louder concerns about the political implications of elevating an unknown stranger to such significant standing within the kingdom. Cordelia, whose earlier private concerns had been addressed directly by Cale weeks earlier, found herself caught between her genuine respect for the king's judgment and mounting pressure from fellow traditionalist council members who viewed the situation with growing alarm. She approached Cale privately once again, her expression carrying visible tension as she navigated the delicate political situation. "I believe your judgment regarding the treaty acknowledgement was sound," she said carefully, "and I do not doubt the genuine nature of your bond with Wren. But others within the council remain unconvinced, and their concerns, however misguided, carry real political weight that cannot simply be dismissed." "What would satisfy their concerns?" Cale asked, genuinely seeking a path forward that might ease the growing tension without compromising his commitment to Wren or the historical truth they had worked to uncover. Cordelia considered the question carefully. Perhaps a formal, independent verification of the historical documents, conducted by scholars from outside your own court, individuals whose neutrality cannot reasonably be questioned. Such verification might satisfy even the most skeptical among the traditionalist faction. Cale discussed the suggestion with Wren and Edmund later that evening, weighing the benefits of such independent verification against the risk of appearing to legitimize the baseless accusations circulating through the court. "I understand the political logic," Wren said slowly, "but it troubles me that we must prove the truth of my own family's history to satisfy doubts that were never raised with any genuine evidence to support them." "I understand your frustration," Cale said gently, "and you have every right to feel troubled by this demand, but sometimes, addressing baseless accusations directly, however unfair the burden feels, proves more effective than simply dismissing them and allowing doubt to fester unaddressed." Wren nodded slowly, understanding the political wisdom in his reasoning, even as the unfairness of the situation weighed heavily on her. "Then let's proceed with the verification," she said finally. "I have nothing to hide, and if independent scholars confirm what we've already discovered, perhaps this challenge will finally be put to rest." Arrangements were made for a delegation of respected scholars from neighboring territories, individuals known for their impartiality and expertise in ancient Pack history, to review the documents Cale and Wren had discovered in the archives. The process took several tense weeks, during which the court remained divided, whispers and speculation continuing to circulate, despite Cale's attempts to maintain calm and stability throughout the kingdom. During this tense period, Cale discovered, through careful investigation conducted by Edmund and his most trusted guards, that one of the nobles who had signed the formal challenge letter maintained secret correspondence with representatives from Garrick's territory, correspondence that suggested exactly the kind of coordinated manipulation Edmund had initially suspected. The noble, a minor lord named Percival, had apparently been convinced to lend his signature and influence to the challenge, in exchange for promises of expanded territory and influence, should Garrick's broader ambitions against Ashbourne eventually succeed. Confronted with the evidence of his secret correspondence, Percival confessed fully, revealing the extent of Garrick's continued efforts to destabilize Ashbourne's political landscape from beyond its borders, efforts that had continued unabated despite the failed ambush months earlier. He also revealed, with visible reluctance, that Lyra had provided some of the initial information that had enabled the formal challenge letter's careful construction, though he insisted she had grown increasingly hesitant about continuing her involvement in Garrick's broader schemes. This revelation struck Cale with complicated emotion, understanding that Lyra's continued entanglement in these schemes, however reluctant, traced directly back to the pain and humiliation his own careless rejection had caused her months earlier. "She deserves acknowledgement of that pain," he said quietly to Wren, once Percival's confession had been fully documented, and the immediate political crisis addressed, through the exposure of Garrick's manipulation. "Perhaps," Wren said carefully, "once the independent scholars complete their verification, and this challenge is properly resolved, you might consider reaching out to her directly, not to rekindle anything romantic, but simply to offer the acknowledgement and apology she never received that night in the Great Hall." Cale considered her suggestion seriously, understanding that genuine resolution of his own past mistakes required more than simply moving forward with his new life alongside Wren, but also required addressing the harm he had caused others along the way, regardless of how uncomfortable or politically complicated such acknowledgement might prove. The independent scholars ultimately confirmed everything Cale and Wren had discovered in their own research, verifying beyond reasonable doubt the authenticity of the historical treaty documents and the legitimacy of Wren's family lineage. Their formal report, presented before the full council, effectively silenced the challenge that Garrick's manipulation had orchestrated, restoring stability to the political situation, while further solidifying public support for both the historical acknowledgement and the mating bond that had formed between Cale and Wren. But even as this particular crisis resolved successfully, Cale understood, with growing clarity, that Garrick's ambitions toward Ashbourne territory remained far from extinguished. The failed ambush, the subsequent political manipulation, all represented pieces of a broader campaign that Garrick seemed determined to continue pursuing, regardless of the setbacks he encountered along the way. And somewhere within that ongoing campaign, Lyra remained entangled, her own path forward uncertain as she navigated the growing gulf between her initial desire for simple acknowledgement and the increasingly dangerous political game Garrick continued playing at her expense. Percival's punishment became another delicate matter, requiring careful consideration. Some among the council demanded severe consequences for his betrayal, exile, or stripping of his title entirely, while others argued for leniency, given his cooperation, once confronted with evidence of his secret correspondence. Chaol ultimately decided on a measured response, stripping Percival of his council position and imposing significant financial penalties, but allowing him to retain his family title, a decision he explained carefully to the assembled court. Justice tempered with mercy serves this kingdom better than punishment alone, Chaol said during the formal proceeding, addressing Percival's betrayal. He made a grave error in judgment, motivated by fear and ambition, rather than genuine malice toward this kingdom. His cooperation in exposing the broader scheme against us deserves acknowledgement, even as his betrayal demands consequence. The decision received mixed reactions among the council, though most nobles ultimately respected the careful balance Chaol struck between accountability and compassion, a balance that stood in notable contrast to the impulsive cruelty that had marked his earlier rejection of Lyra. Ren watched the proceedings with quiet pride, recognizing in Chaol's measured judgment the genuine growth that had occurred within him since those early days when she first woke wounded in his infirmary. That evening, as the immediate political crisis finally settled into calmer waters, Chaol found himself reflecting seriously on Ren's earlier suggestion regarding Lyra. He drafted a careful letter, acknowledging directly and without excuse the pain his public rejection had caused her, offering genuine apology for the cruelty of his words and the humiliation he had subjected her to before the entire court. He made no attempt to justify his earlier decision, understanding now, with painful clarity, exactly how much damage his careless judgment had inflicted on someone who had trusted him with her future. He sent the letter through a neutral intermediary, uncertain whether Lyra would even accept such an acknowledgement given her continued, if reluctant, involvement in Garrick's schemes against him. But he understood that genuine accountability required the attempt, regardless of whether reconciliation ultimately proved possible. Ren read the letter before he sent it, offering quiet support as he worked through the difficult process of confronting his own past mistakes honestly. "This matters," she said softly, once he had finished drafting the final version. "Not because it excuses what happened, but because genuine growth requires acknowledging harm, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or complicated. I should have offered this acknowledgement months ago," Chaol admitted, "before circumstances became so complicated, by Garrick's manipulation and the broader political conflict between our territories." "Perhaps," Ren said gently, "but offering it now, once you've genuinely grown enough to understand its importance, carries its own kind of meaning. Growth rarely follows a perfect timeline, Chaol. What matters is that you're offering this acknowledgement honestly, rather than avoiding it entirely." As the letter made its way toward Lyra through careful, discreet channels, neither Chaol nor Ren yet knew how she would receive it, or whether her continued entanglement with Garrick's ambitions had progressed too far for genuine reconciliation to remain possible. But within the palace walls, as the political crisis triggered by the false challenge finally settled and stability returned to Ashbourne's court, both Chaol and Ren understood that their bond, having survived its first significant test, had grown only stronger through the shared challenge of confronting Garrick's manipulation together, a foundation of trust and partnership that would prove essential for whatever challenges still awaited them in the difficult days ahead. Fire lit the night sky along the southern border, as watchtowers sent urgent signals racing toward the palace, warning of a massed force crossing into Ashbourne territory under cover of darkness. Chaol was pulled from sleep by Edmund's urgent knocking, his old advisor's face grim with an intensity that told him immediately the situation carried far greater weight than another simple border skirmish. "Garrick has committed fully this time," Edmund said, barely waiting for Chaol to gather himself before continuing. "Scouts report a force of nearly 1,000 soldiers crossing the border an hour ago. This is no longer a matter of political pressure or isolated ambush. This is invasion." Chaol's blood ran cold at the words, understanding immediately the gravity of what Garrick had finally chosen to unleash. "Assemble the council immediately," he said, already moving toward his armor. And send word to every garrison within reach. We need every available soldier mobilized before dawn. Within the hour, the palace had transformed into a hub of urgent activity. Soldiers rushing to prepare for deployment. Messengers dispatched toward every corner of the kingdom, carrying urgent calls for reinforcement. Ren found Kale in the war room, studying maps spread across the long table, his expression carrying the weight of a decision that would determine the fate of countless lives across his kingdom. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, before he could even voice the objection she knew was forming in his mind. "Ren, this is different from the ambush at the border meeting," Kale said, turning to face her directly. "This is a full invasion. The danger is far greater than anything we've faced together thus far." "Which is exactly why you need every capable fighter you can gather," Ren countered, refusing to back down despite the concern evident in his expression. "I won't hide safely within these walls while you face this danger alone." Kale studied her for a long moment, understanding the futility of arguing against her fierce determination, recognizing in her stubborn resolve the same strength that had first drawn him to her in those northern woods months earlier. "Then you stay close to Edmund's command position," he said finally. "Not on the front lines directly, but close enough to respond if the situation demands it." Ren nodded, accepting the compromise, and together they turned their attention back to the maps, working alongside Edmund and the assembled generals to formulate a strategy capable of meeting Garrick's invasion force with whatever advantage Ashbourne's smaller, but more familiar terrain could provide. As dawn broke over the kingdom, Ashbourne's assembled forces, bolstered by soldiers rushing in from garrisons throughout the territory, met Garrick's invading army at a wide valley several miles from the palace, a location chosen carefully by Edmund for its strategic advantages, despite the numerical disadvantage Ashbourne's forces faced. Kale rode at the head of his soldiers, his expression carrying the steady resolve of a king determined to protect his people, regardless of the personal cost such protection might demand. The battle that followed raged for hours, chaos and desperate courage defining every exchange, as Ashbourne's forces fought to hold their position against Garrick's numerically superior army. Kale fought alongside his soldiers with fierce determination, his earlier training and years of preparation for exactly this kind of moment finally proving their worth as he led charge after charge against the invading forces threatening everything he had sworn to protect. Ren, stationed near Edmund's command position exactly as promised, found herself drawn increasingly into the thick of the fighting as the battle's chaos spilled beyond the carefully planned formations. Soldiers from both sides scattered across the valley in desperate, close combat. When a group of Garrick's soldiers broke through Ashbourne's flank, threatening to surround Edmund's command position entirely, Ren did not hesitate, drawing her blade and fighting alongside the remaining defenders with the same fierce skill she had demonstrated during the earlier ambush months before. "Fall back toward the ridge," Edmund shouted, recognizing the danger of their exposed position, though the encroaching soldiers made any organized retreat increasingly difficult to execute safely. It was in the midst of this desperate fighting that Kale, having fought his way toward the command position upon hearing of the breach, found himself face to face with Garrick himself, the rival pack leader having pushed forward personally to oversee what he clearly believed would be a decisive victory against Ashbourne's forces. "You should have simply accepted my terms months ago," Garrick said, his blade raised, as the two leaders circled each other amid the chaos of battle surrounding them. "This bloodshed could have been avoided entirely." "You attacked my people under the guise of diplomatic negotiation," Kale replied, his own blade steady, despite the exhaustion of hours of continuous fighting. "There was never a version of your terms I could have accepted with honor." Their blades met with a force that sent sparks flying, each strike carrying the weight of months of accumulated tension between their two territories. Garrick fought with calculated precision, every movement designed to exploit weakness, while Kale fought with the desperate determination of a king protecting everything he held dear, his thoughts flickering repeatedly toward Ren's safety, even as he focused every ounce of skill and strength against the immediate threat before him. The duel raged fiercely, both leaders sustaining wounds, as the battle around them continued unabated, soldiers from both sides, locked in desperate combat, that showed no immediate sign of resolution. Just as Garrick's blade found an opening, striking a glancing blow against Kale's shoulder that sent pain lancing through his entire arm, a fierce cry rang out nearby, as Ren, having fought her way through the chaos toward Kale's position, intervened directly, her own blade catching Garrick's follow-up strike, before it could land the killing blow he had clearly intended. "Stay away from him," Ren said fiercely, positioning herself protectively, despite Kale's own attempts to shield her from the danger of direct confrontation with Garrick. Garrick's eyes flickered with recognition and calculation as he studied Ren directly, for the first time since the failed ambush months earlier. "The lineage that started all of this," he said, something almost admiring in his tone despite the danger of their current confrontation. "Perhaps I should have simply captured you from the very beginning, rather than pursuing this costly conflict." "You'll have neither of us," Kale said, recovering from the shoulder wound, enough to position himself once more beside Ren, the two of them facing Garrick together, with a unified resolve that made the rival leader's confident expression falter slightly, for the first time since the battle had begun. Their combined effort, fighting together with the kind of instinctive coordination that only their deep bond could provide, finally overwhelmed Garrick's defenses, Ren's swift precision, creating openings that Kale's greater strength exploited decisively. With a final, coordinated strike, they disarmed Garrick entirely, forcing him to his knees before them, as Ashbourne soldiers, having witnessed their leader's defeat, quickly surrounded and secured him. News of Garrick's capture spread rapidly across the battlefield, and within minutes, his remaining forces, disorganized and demoralized by the loss of their leader, began a chaotic retreat that Ashbourne's soldiers pursued only far enough to ensure the immediate threat had fully passed. The battle, which had begun with such desperate uncertainty at dawn, concluded by midday, with Ashbourne's forces claiming decisive victory, though the cost in lives and injuries across both sides remained heartbreakingly significant. Kale, wounded but alive, immediately turned his attention to Ren, checking her carefully for injuries. Despite her own attempts to insist, she remained largely unharmed, beyond minor cuts and bruises sustained during the fierce fighting. "You shouldn't have intervened so directly," he said, though the fierce gratitude and relief in his voice contradicted any genuine criticism in his words. "And let Garrick land a killing blow against you?" Ren countered, though her own hands trembled slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline finally beginning to fade. "I told you I wouldn't hide safely while you faced danger alone." Edmund approached, his own uniform torn and bloodied from the fierce fighting, though his expression carried something like pride as he surveyed the scene before him. "A decisive victory," he said, "and Garrick captured alive, which gives us significant leverage in negotiating a lasting peace, rather than simply continuing this cycle of conflict indefinitely." As the immediate aftermath of the battle settled into the exhausting work of tending wounded soldiers and beginning the difficult process of formal negotiation with Garrick's remaining territory, Kale and Ren found a brief moment of quiet together amid the chaos, both finally allowing themselves to fully process the reality that they had survived a conflict that could have easily claimed either of their lives. "We did this together," Kale said softly, pulling her carefully into an embrace despite his wounded shoulder, the significance of their combined effort against Garrick settling deeply into his understanding of exactly what their bond truly meant, beyond simple personal connection. "We'll continue doing everything together," Ren said firmly, her voice carrying quiet certainty despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. "Whatever challenges remain ahead, in negotiating peace, in rebuilding what this conflict has cost, we'll face them as partners, exactly as we faced this battle." As the sun began setting over the valley, casting long shadows across a battlefield finally quieting after hours of fierce conflict, Kale and Ren understood that whatever difficult work remained ahead in securing lasting peace and rebuilding trust between their territories, the foundation of their bond, tested now through genuine crisis and proven unshakable through shared sacrifice, would carry them through whatever challenges the future still held in store. In the days following the battle, Garrick remained confined within a secure chamber of the palace, awaiting formal judgment from Kale and the council regarding the consequences of his aggression. Negotiations with representatives from his own territory began cautiously, many of his advisors relieved to seek peaceful resolution rather than continuing a costly conflict their leader's ambitions had provoked, without broad support among his own people. Lyra arrived at the palace during this tense period of negotiation, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of grief and resolve, as she requested a formal audience with Kale. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the court, old speculation and curiosity reigniting, as nobles wondered what business could bring her back to the palace she had fled in humiliation months earlier. Kale received her privately, in the same study where he had drafted his letter of acknowledgement weeks before, Ren present at his side, though careful to allow Lyra the space to speak freely, without feeling crowded or judged by their combined presence. "I received your letter," Lyra said, her voice steady, despite the visible tension in her posture. "I wanted to respond in person, rather than through written correspondence alone." "I meant every word," Kale said sincerely. "What I did to you that night was cruel and unnecessary. You deserved far better from me, regardless of whatever pressures I believed I faced as a newly crowned king." Lyra studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity in his acknowledgement, before finally allowing herself a small, tired smile. "I've spent months caught between grief and anger," she admitted. "I made choices I'm not proud of, alliances I should have questioned more carefully from the very beginning. But hearing this acknowledgement, genuinely offered rather than simply extracted through political necessity, matters more than I expected it to." "What will you do now?" Ren asked gently, genuine concern evident in her tone despite the complicated history connecting all three of them. "I don't fully know yet," Lyra admitted, "but I intend to distance myself entirely from Garrick's ambitions, and to find some way forward that doesn't depend on revenge or bitterness defining the rest of my life." Kale nodded slowly, understanding the courage such an admission required. "You'll always have a place of respect within this kingdom, Lyra, regardless of the painful history between us. I hope you're able to find genuine peace and purpose moving forward." As Lyra departed the palace that same afternoon, her path forward uncertain but no longer entangled in Garrick's dangerous schemes, Kale and Ren turned their attention back toward the delicate work of formalizing peace with Garrick's territory, a process that would require patience, careful diplomacy, and the kind of genuine partnership they had proven capable of throughout every challenge they had faced together since that fateful night in the northern woods. Bells rang out across the Ashbourne kingdom, echoing from the palace towers through every village and settlement within the territory, announcing a celebration unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in generations. Months had passed since the decisive battle against Garrick's forces, months filled with careful negotiation, gradual healing, and the steady work of rebuilding trust, both within Ashbourne's own court and along its previously contested southern border. Garrick, following extensive negotiation, had ultimately been stripped of significant territory and forced to accept strict terms limiting his military capacity for a generation, terms his own people, weary of a costly conflict their leader had provoked without their support, had largely welcomed as a path toward lasting stability. Kale had insisted on terms that punished Garrick's aggression without unnecessarily punishing the broader population who had suffered under his ambitious rule, a balance of justice and mercy that had earned Kale considerable respect even among skeptical observers from neighboring territories. Within Ashbourne itself, the kingdom had used the months following the conflict to begin genuine healing, addressing not only the immediate wounds of battle, but the deeper historical wounds that had first brought Ren into Kale's life. The formal acknowledgement of her family's displacement had expanded into broader initiatives, programs designed to research and address other historical injustices that had gone unacknowledged for generations, a legacy Kale and Ren had committed to together, as fundamental to the kind of kingdom they intended to build. Today, however, marked a celebration entirely separate from politics or historical reckoning, a day the entire kingdom had eagerly anticipated for weeks. The Great Hall, transformed once again, this time with decorations celebrating not simply acknowledgement of the past, but genuine joy for the future, prepared to host the formal bonding celebration marking Kale and Ren's union before the full court, and representatives from territories throughout the region. Ren stood in a private chamber adjoining the Great Hall, dressed in flowing fabric that combined traditional Ashbourne styling with elements recovered from her own family's ancient customs, a fusion that felt entirely appropriate given everything that had brought her to this moment. Her hands trembled slightly, though the nervousness carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had once defined so much of her guarded existence before arriving in this kingdom. "You look beautiful," Edmund said, entering the chamber with warmth evident in his weathered features, having grown genuinely fond of Ren over the months since her arrival, watching her transform not just Kale's personal happiness, but the broader character of his rule as king. "Thank you," Ren said softly, "for everything you've done to help us reach this day. Your wisdom and guidance have meant more than I think you realize." Edmund smiled warmly, offering his arm to escort her toward the Great Hall's entrance. "It has been my honor to witness this transformation, both in you and in Kale. Your grandmother, wherever her spirit rests, would be immensely proud of everything you've accomplished." The words settled warmly in Ren's chest as they made their way toward the entrance, and when the great doors finally opened, revealing the assembled crowd waiting within, she felt none of the overwhelming anxiety that had once accompanied her arrival in this same hall months earlier. Instead, genuine joy and anticipation carried her forward, toward Kale, who waited at the center of the hall, his expression radiant with love and pride as he watched her approach. The ceremony that followed combined formal Ashbourne tradition with the recovered customs of Ren's own ancestral lineage, a blending that Edmund and several respected elders had helped carefully design over recent months, ensuring both traditions received proper honor and respect. Kale spoke his formal vows with genuine emotion, acknowledging not only his commitment to Ren personally, but his commitment to ruling with the kind of wisdom, humility, and genuine care for all his people that their journey together had taught him. "When I first became king," Kale said, addressing not only Ren, but the entire assembled crowd, "I believed strength meant projecting an image of power and control, regardless of the cost to genuine connection or understanding. I was wrong, in ways that caused real harm to someone who deserved far better from me." He paused, his gaze finding Lyra briefly among the crowd, where she stood with quiet dignity, having accepted his invitation to attend the celebration as a sign of the genuine reconciliation that had gradually developed between them in the months following her departure from Garrick's schemes. She offered him a small, genuine smile of acknowledgement, free now of the bitterness that had once defined their painful history. "Ren taught me," Kale continued, turning his attention back to his bonded mate, "that true strength lies not in projecting power, but in genuine honesty, in the courage to acknowledge mistakes and work toward meaningful change, and in valuing people for their character and wisdom, rather than superficial measures of presence or status." Ren, her own eyes bright with emotion, spoke her vows in return, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I came to this kingdom, searching for understanding of my family's history, never imagining I would find not only that understanding, but a partner whose genuine growth and commitment to justice would reshape how I understood my own place in the world. Together, we've proven that a bond built on honesty and mutual respect can overcome even the most difficult challenges, and I look forward to building a future with you that honors both our histories and the lessons we've learned together." As the formal ceremony concluded, the crowd erupted into genuine celebration. The earlier tension and division that had once marked discussions of their unprecedented bond having long since transformed into widespread admiration and support. Common folk and nobles alike joined in the festivities that continued long into the evening, music and dancing filling the great hall and spilling out into the palace gardens, where Kale and Ren eventually found a quiet moment together, beneath the same oak tree where their relationship had first begun to deepen months earlier. "Do you remember?" Ren said softly, leaning against him as they watched the distant celebration continuing within the illuminated hall. "When you first found me in the northern woods, I never could have imagined this is where that chance encounter would eventually lead. I think some part of me knew, even then, that you would change everything about how I understood leadership, and love, and genuine strength," Kale replied, pulling her closer against him. "Finding you wounded in those woods turned out to be the beginning of the most important transformation of my entire life." Ren smiled, tilting her head up to meet his gaze directly. "We still have significant work ahead of us, rebuilding trust with Garrick's territory, continuing the historical reckoning we've begun, addressing whatever other challenges arise as we build this future together." "I know," Kale said, "but for the first time since taking this crown, I feel genuinely prepared to face whatever challenges come, knowing I'll face them with you beside me, rather than alone." As the celebration continued behind them, and as the kingdom settled into a new chapter defined by genuine partnership, historical accountability, and hard-won wisdom about the true nature of strength and worth, Kale and Ren stood together beneath the quiet oak tree, their bond having transformed not only their own lives, but the broader character of the entire kingdom they now ruled together. The rejection that had once defined the beginning of this story, cruel and short-sighted as it had been, had ultimately given way to something far more profound, a genuine partnership built on honesty, growth, and the recognition that true worth had never been measured by size or presence, but by character, courage, and the willingness to learn and change for the better. Far beyond the palace walls, throughout villages and settlements across Ashbourne territory, people continued celebrating late into the night, sharing stories of the king who had learned from his mistakes, and the remarkable Omega whose courage and wisdom had helped guide an entire kingdom toward a more just and honest future. Their story, once defined by public humiliation and cruel rejection, had transformed into something the entire kingdom would remember and retell for generations, a testament to the possibility of genuine growth, meaningful reconciliation, and the enduring power of a bond built on truth rather than superficial judgment. And as the stars emerged fully overhead, casting gentle light across the peaceful kingdom below, Chaol and Ren remained together, beneath their oak tree, content in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future still held, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that fateful night in the northern woods, together, honestly, and with a bond that had proven, time and again, unshakable in the face of every test placed before it. In the weeks that followed the celebration, life within the palace settled into a new, steady rhythm. Ren took on a formal role advising the council on matters of historical justice, working alongside Edmund to identify other communities across the kingdom whose histories had been overlooked or forgotten over generations. Her efforts, though sometimes met with lingering resistance from the most traditional voices within the court, gradually earned widespread respect as the tangible benefits of her work became increasingly evident throughout the territory. Chaol, meanwhile, continued the delicate process of solidifying peace with Garrick's former territory, traveling personally to meet with local leaders and ensure the terms of the settlement served genuine stability, rather than simply punishing a defeated rival. His willingness to engage directly, rather than delegating such difficult diplomatic work entirely to advisors, earned him a reputation among neighboring territories as a king who valued genuine understanding over simple political convenience. Lyra, having fully distanced herself from Garrick's ambitions, eventually found a new purpose within a neighboring territory, where her deep knowledge of court politics and diplomacy proved valuable to a ruling family seeking to strengthen their own governance. She and Chaol maintained respectful, if distant, correspondence in the years that followed, their painful history gradually settling into something closer to genuine mutual respect, an outcome neither of them would have believed possible during those raw, difficult early days following her rejection. As seasons turned, and the kingdom continued its steady healing, Chaol and Ren's partnership only deepened further, their bond serving as a quiet but powerful example throughout the territory of what genuine leadership, built on humility and honest growth, could accomplish. Villages that had once felt disconnected from the distant concerns of the palace found themselves increasingly included in the kingdom's broader conversations about justice and community, a shift many attributed directly to Ren's steady influence and Chaol's willingness to listen and change. Years later, when historians and storytellers throughout the region recounted the tale of the Alpha King who had once cruelly rejected his intended mate for something as shallow as her size, they inevitably continued the story toward its unexpected conclusion, the arrival of a remarkable Omega, whose courage, wisdom, and unshakable integrity had ultimately transformed not just one king's understanding of genuine worth, but the character of an entire kingdom. It became a story parents told their children throughout Ashbourne territory, a reminder that true strength lay not in outward presence or superficial judgment, but in honesty, growth, and the courage to build something meaningful from even the most painful beginnings. And within the palace itself, long after the celebrations had faded and the difficult work of rebuilding trust had settled into steady, ongoing progress, Chaol and Ren remained exactly what they had promised each other, beneath that quiet oak tree, genuine partners, bound not by ancient obligation or political necessity, but by a connection forged through honesty, shared sacrifice, and an enduring commitment to becoming better, together, than either of them could have become in better.